Good afternoon and a warm welcome back to our contributors and audience. I'm Lucy Davis, Curator of Flemish and British Paintings and Chair of this session, Inspiration and Legacy. You might have noticed yesterday that there was a thunderstorm going on in London during our presentations, appropriately enough on the rainbow landscape and the stormy landscape, an apt prelude perhaps to the theme of the forces of nature and how artists respond to them, which we will be discussing this afternoon. In this session, Dr. Karina Kleinert and Professor Elizabeth Mcgrath will explore the inspiration that Rubens drew from Het Steen and nature. Dr. Galinda Gruber will explore the pictorial and textual sources that inspired the stormy landscape. We will then turn to Rubens's artistic legacy with Professor Niels Butner's presentation on the artistic exchange between Rubens and the artists and art lovers of the provinces of the Northern Netherlands. At the end of this session, we will have a 10-minute Q&A with the speakers from the first panel. The second session will involve the speakers from just that session, the final session. Please ask questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Karina Kleinert, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the State Academy of Art and Design in Stuttgart, where she is working on the Flemish landscape painter Lucas van Uden. The title of her PhD thesis, published in 2014, is Peter Paul Rubens and His Landscapes, Ideas on Art, on Nature and Art. The title of her talk today is Rubens and His Landscapes, Reflections on the Notion of Otium. Over to you, Karina.
Thank you, Lucy, and thanks for your introduction, and also thanks to all of you who have organized this wonderful webinar. It was mentioned several times yesterday and noted by his contemporaries and earliest biographers that Rubens celebrated country life as a place of contemplative leisure and found in landscape painting an artistic expression of the contemplation of the natural world. In this talk, I would like to shed light on this fundamental contemporary notion that reflects in Rubens's landscape art, contemporary leisure, or the constructive side of otium. I shall highlight the active otium in which Rubens's landscapes were painted and investigate both the places and motives of otium to uncover alternate routes into their complex meaning and organic growth. Since antiquity, a public person's duties or working time, their negotium, had been distinguished from leisure time, or otium. Although classical otium referred to the period after retirement from civic duties, the 17th century typically defined it, as in the writings of Rubens's correspondent and admirer Constantijn Huygens, which I'm showing you here in this slide, as the time available to a public figure in between his official duties. The Latin term otium, imperfectly translated by various English terms, can indicate leisure time, peace, or idleness, and is accompanied by the notions of ease, contemplation, recreation, pastime, privacy, retirement, or welcome solitude. Increasingly defined, otium seems to have been ever more specifically valued in Rubens's time and was linked to particular places and activities. It was understood as the time spent in country houses or on sacred days, as well as the intellectual organization of free time in the form of either contemplative leisure or idleness. Otium was conceived as a liberty from the duty of negotium, bound to specific places such as the countryside, and the freedom to organize one's time in a self-determined way. But to be considered honorable, it had to be distinguished from stagnant idleness through an occupation credited as meaningful. Pursued in this way, otium, like contemplative leisure, had the potential to generate contentment. Otium, understood as a value, already appears in ancient literature together with the terms quies and tranquillitas, with the difference in meaning only often gradual. but the ethically hazardous version of otium originated in Roman moral philosophy. In the private sphere, it corroded people like rust, rendering them lasciviously effeminate or lame like stagnant water, filled with poisonous passions, while in the public sphere, it destroyed morals and caused political riots. This largely negative aura of stagnant otium is still reflected in the 8th emblem, Virtue Depends on Action, which I'm showing you here, from the influential 1607 Emblemata Horatiana, composed by Otto van Veen, Rubens' former teacher. Rubens quite likely meditated on his copy of this emblem, which clearly presupposed that any virtue in otium derives from action. Not surprisingly, almost all personifications of Ozio in Cesare Ripa's monumental Iconologia have negative connotations, except for one that he defines more favorably as contemplazione. The 1644 Dutch translation of Iconologia also generally understood Ozio as ladyhead or laziness, but distinguished in the last section of the 5th image that laziness is not understood here as reflection or contemplation. Rubens was certainly familiar with such sentiment. The topicality of honest leisure and useful recreation at the time echoes in an anecdote about Rubens in Samuel van Hoogstraten's Inleiding tot de Hoogschool Schilderkunst. He recounts that Rubens was criticized by a fellow painter during his stay in Rome because, I quote, he copied or drew after so few Italian paintings and only spent his precious time wandering, looking, and sitting quietly. When the painter warned Rubens that diligently working day and night were necessary to become a great master, Rubens laughed and reportedly answered with the Ciceronian phrase, "I am most busy when you see me idle." An acceptable otium at that time, therefore, required qualification as active or fruitful, a leisure which yielded works of literature, poetry, philosophy, or history, and thus distinguishing itself from stagnant idleness. The realm of otium, from its solely negative connotations, is reflected in the lyric of the day, the reclaim of otium. Huygens, to name but one example, entitled the collection of poems he wrote between his demanding service for the Princess of Orange and his restorative sojourns to the countryside, Otia, or Idle Hours. Being his fruits of leisure. The second title page of Huygens' Otia depicts a sheet of paper fixed to the background by 2 arrows supporting an unstrung bow. This image, of course, derived from the renowned topos employed by Karel van Mander, amongst others, to validate the need for restoration in the form of cultivated leisure or otium. Van Mander's chapter on landscape painting associates the contemplation of nature with leisure and artistic inspiration. In doing so, endows landscape with its most common poetical meaning. Huygens' country house poem, Vitalium Hofwijk, dated 1653, further elaborates on this contemplative investment of otium. The first country house poet to use a leisurely stroll, a wandeling, through the estate, guides readers to the locus classicus for his cultivated leisure, where everything grew and flowered in the garden that was laid out around the moated country house. Approaching the house from the more sylvan part of the garden, a little wood of coppiced oaks with lush undergrowth and mossy withered bones opens up the view to the east facade, showing a trompe cartouche inscribed otium, reflecting the genius loci of the site. Rubens and Huygens were exceptional figures of the interlocking elite of the day, who had much in common. From 1635 until his death, the two men exchanged letters about art and architecture, indicating a potential for significant overlap in artistic philosophy, particularly as it relates to the role of otium in their late careers. In his autobiographic country house poem, Huygens avows that he retreats to Hofwijk to do what he cannot achieve in the city of The Hague, think and contemplate, and therefore engage in active otium. Like a pearl diver searching for oysters, he tells his audience that he pursues the pearls of virtue, and knowledge at the bottom of his calm green ocean. At Hofwijk, Huygens was lord of his time, and his leisure hours made him free for a new intellectual pursuit, the active contemplation of the natural surroundings as manifested in his Hofdicht. From the contemplation of nature as a means of recreation, applies to divert and console, it is but a short step to the contemplation of nature's surrogate in art. And it was a similar productive energy, a form of visual Hofgedicht or Veldgedicht, I believe, that led Rubens to turn to painting landscapes like the splendid pendants, View of Het Steen, and the Rainbow Landscape. Proposing honest active otium as an underlying quality essential to the largest part of Rubens' uncommissioned landscape art enables us to consider his searching engagement with landscape painting, especially in his last years, as an extension of and an active form of the contemplation of the natural world. While not an idea that Rubens followed pragmatically, understanding otium as a form of contemplative leisure offers a contemporary approach, just as the concept of ut pictura poesis and Horace's utile dulce, to amuse profitably, to illuminate the complex and differing layers of meaning. Rubens appears to have pursued landscape painting alongside the industry of his Antwerp workshop. In 1630, Balthasar Moretus records that Rubens prepared the title page designs, which involved more intellectual than physical effort, in his, quote, free time and on sacred days. It might thus be possible that Rubens also reserved his greater otium to the painting of landscapes. A letter sent from Het Steen confirms that he also painted during his leisurely sojourns in the countryside. It was Huygens, again, who knew that this pleasurable diversion of Rubens also included landscape painting. At the end of the 1620s, he wrote, and I quote, "When an infectious disease that recently reigned the city forced him to a country place, he applied himself to the painting of landscapes with the same fruitfulness and proficiency as he had to other works." The making of his landscapes has been associated by Huygens with a temporary break, a chosen refuge, possibly from the plague that was raging at that time in Antwerp. In his country place, probably Hof van Ursele, a so-called pleasure court with farm and woodlands in the village of Ekeren, just outside Antwerp, Rubens experienced a phase of productive release by turning his creative powers from making historia towards the study of nature in the form of landscapes. Huygens' account is reinforced in the biographical notes by the artist's nephew Philip, who some 50 years later wrote to Roger de Pile that Rubens' late landscapes in particular originated in the tranquility of the artist's leisure. Writing, "Having bought the scenery of Steen between Brussels and Malines in the year 1630, he got that date wrong, and I quote, "He took great pleasure living there in solitude in order to paint vividly and au naturel the surrounding mountains, plains, valleys, and meadows at the rising and setting of the sun up to the horizon." Rubens is said to have enjoyed this activity in solitude, a practice reminiscent of Petrarca, Saint Jerome, and earlier classical sources. Otium was also exercised in the visual and artistic contemplation of a variety of pleasant places and motifs to be found in the native surroundings of Het Steen. We can see how Rubens projects the pleasure of his gaze in vividly painting the wide-ranging prospect of the fertile plain with its varied vegetation, rows of trees, of forests crisscrossed by streams and ditches lined with willows. It was this extensive panorama of the native Flemish countryside that, according to his nephew, Rubens had painted up to the horizon. A line of birds in the sky lead the gaze into the far distance, where we might spot a castile or the church spire of some distant city, barely discernible reminders of the court or urban marketplace as places of negotium. Gradually, step by step, we move from engaged viewing in the foreground details that were understood at the time to inspire the fantasia of the beholder, to relaxation in the softened color, light and form in the distance, echoing stillness and quiet. Meanwhile, the most straightforward motive of otium, or contemplative leisure if in rustic mode, can be found in a reoccurring shepherd with loosely crossed legs leaning on a stick. This old gestus, and Justus Müller-Hofstede once thought this might represent Otium sapiensis when he looked at the honeysuckle bower in Munich. This old gestus of the crossed legs, signaling a contemplative, even meditative attitude, is shown in the shepherd with his flock in the woody landscapes, which I'm showing you in this slide, or a goatherd playing the flute with leisurely reclining under a tree in the watering place. Or yet another shepherd with crossed legs resting on a bench, watching his flock with his dog and playing the flute in the late landscape with a shepherd and his flock. Echoing Virgil's idyllic vision of the shepherd poet in the first eclogue, those herdsmen, like Virgil's, appear to stay there until the setting of the sun brings a natural end to their song, and it is time to return home with their flock. Although these works betray an innocent but inactive otium, most of Rubens' landscapes evoke a Georgic rather than a pastoral or bucolic frame of mind. Such Georgic landscapes, like the two great landscapes, praise rural labors and pursuits and show rustic figures who go about their daily tasks in a diligent and prudent manner. Well-fed and happy country folk, content to execute their daily tasks, evoke the riches to be found within the countryside itself and reflect an Edenic tranquility, where agriculture was neither laborious nor anguishing, but full of pleasure. James Ackerman has pointed out that in the Georgics, and I quote, the life and labors of peasants and shepherds are represented as the optimal and most ethical existence. But like the city-based villa owners, Virgil represents farming as a calling free of care and unwanted distraction, which offers even the farmer the opportunity for otium. The praise of dignity of labor also relates to the land from which bounty and ultimately otium develops, such that satisfaction with little becomes virtue. Rubens's focus, however, is clearly on the tranquility and felicity achieved through working the land of one's ancestors, as explained in the emblem, the happiness of agriculture, of the Emblemata Horatiana. The emblem presents felicity not as idle ease, but again as peace of mind achieved through the work of one's hands. Another ramification, albeit more humble, of an active otium, reflecting the ethical perspective of city dwellers seeking and praising otium in depicting the fecundity of their native countryside. In the late 1640s, the English miniature painter Edward Norgate reckons Rubens as, quote, a great gentleman of great parts and abilities over and above his pencil, and knighted by the best of kings or men, and claimed that his landscapes were only created after he had given up earning his living by the work of his hands. Norgate understood them to be virtuous manifestation of an aristocratic attitude, a leisurely privilege of his class, for they were painted solely for the master's pleasure and delight in nature. Rubens, the Lord of Steen and owner of large latifundia, was, according to nature, in the fortunate position to retire from his daily business, or negotium in Antwerp, to retreat to his otium and lead a rather carefree and tranquil life of contemplative rest and restorative pleasure at his country estate. And I quote Norgate here again, Sir Peter Rubens of Antwerp was so delighted in his later time with landscape as he quitted all his other practice in picture and story, whereby he got a vast estate to study this, whereof he had left the world the best that are to be seen. So he speaks of the landscape. Norgate's account clearly overstates Rubens's exclusive turn towards landscape painting, as well as his complete withdrawal from business. In fact, the picture doctors continued painting commissions in picture and story until his death. But when Rubens' diplomatic career came to an end in 1634, he was content to divide his time between his Antwerp home and workshop and his semi-retirement at his country estate. In the same year, perhaps during his otium, Rubens also illustrated the title page for the Poemata by Maffeo Barberini, later Pope Urban VIII. In Barberini's Rues Laudes, the refrain runs, "The countryside calls us from the city to the leisure of sweet rest, to innocent delight." Freed from the restraints of court life and the burden of politics, possibly already in the final negotiations for Castle Het Steen, it is quite likely that Rubens would have agreed with this sentiment. In a letter from that same year, Rubens wrote to Nicolas Claude Fabry de Perret, "Now for 3 years, by divine grace, I have found peace of mind, having renounced every sort of employment outside my beloved profession." From 1634 until his death in 1640, Rubens frequently articulated his desire for peaceable, quiet mind and quiet life with his wife and children, tranquility and security, and to avoid every disturbance and intrigue. Only 3 months after purchasing the Seigneury of Steen, he wrote, "It ought to be the wish of every honest man to live in tranquility of mind, both publicly and privately, to render service to the many, and to injure no one." Reflecting the words of St. Augustine's Sentinel, "Prodeste multis nocere nemini," Rubens' statement reveals the pursuit of a stoic unaffectiveness or tranquility of mind, both in his active public life in Antwerp and also in private. During his semi-retirement at his self-proclaimed Villa de Steen, bringing to mind Pliny the Younger's idea of otium villa, his leisure was spent, as he wrote to Perret, not in vicious idleness, but instead as an active form of otium, which included reading, writing, and answering letters, a bel agio, that is, at leisure, and probably also studying rare gems and exquisite metals, with a tranquil mind, and quite likely also painting his landscapes. Rubens's active rural otium furthermore resembles Justus Lipsius' highly influential neo-Stoic garden ethos, the use of nature to pursue the measured bliss of otium, and it was more than mere freedom from professional obligations. It was a freedom to do something. Rubens's otium is negotium actio labor. Dedicated not to scripture, but to pictura, Rubens increasingly sought the recovering effects of verdure in his last years in the surroundings of Castle Het Steen. The visual contemplation of the Grönigheid, the greenery of nature, was at that time not only understood to revitalize the weary eye, but also as meditation and consolidation for the soul, another important prospect of otium proclaimed by contemporary writers, viewers, and artists alike, including Van Mander, Van Hoogstraten, Huygens, Norgate, and also neo-Stoic scholars like Charles Estienne or Pierre Charon. And of course, Rubens owned all of these works. On occasion, landscape painting was even regarded a recreative pursuit of wealthy collectors and amateurs, such as Marcello Sacchetti, the famous patron of Pietro da Cortona. We also know of artists such as Dorsodossi, Girolamo Muziano, or Guercino, who pursued the pleasurable and recreational pastime of painting landscapes. For Rubens, his landscapes seem to have been his otium during a time when he was given important but extremely complicated princely commissions. From 1630 to 35, he was busy designing 9 gigantic ceiling paintings for Banqueting Hall in London, followed by the massive decorations along the princely route of the joyous entry of Cardinal Infante Ferdinand into Antwerp in 1635. In the autumn of 1636, moreover, Rubens received the largest commission of his career, 63 mythological scenes for the new suburban hunting lodge for Philip IV of Spain, the Torre de la Parada. This commission was an artistic and organizational tour de force, to be very quickly designed by Rubens and executed by his workshop, as well as external teams of painters following predetermined designs. Against this background of artistic industry, the landscape views in Landscape with Het Steen and the Rainbow Landscape, or the Late Landscape with a Shepherd, appear as places of a blessed state of otium, a lapse of time to rest in the artistic contemplation of what the artist observed, thought, and knew, and to take a pictorial wandeling in the Flemish fields. This is impressively captured by but one example of a drawing, possibly done on the spot, showing trees reflected in water at sunset, inscribed in Rubens's hand. The reflection of the trees in the water is browner and more perfect in the water than the trees themselves. Here the artist captured precisely what he observed. The viewer, the trees on the far side of the water, and the sun behind them are all in a straight line. The shadows and the images reflected in the water overlap. And then he transcribed his thoughts onto the sketch, possibly reflecting on the contemporary optical observations he knew well. When creating his landscapes, Rubens was freed from the restraints of negotium. He had to follow no contracts, no fixed composition, predetermined format, or preparatory drawing. He took the time and liberty to improvise along his leisurely pictorial wandeling. This autonomy is literally reflected in the often highly complex and expansive makeup of the panels on which he painted his landscapes. In different stages, he reinterpreted and enlarged the self-contained composition of a core panel. George Pisakas demonstrated yesterday that Rubens often completely changed the subject of the landscape, which in its final state differed substantially from his initial idea. This sequence is especially pronounced in the two great landscapes, where Rubens seems to have painted fairly coherently after his panel maker added more space. But in the case of Landscape with Moonlight, he seems to have commanded his panel maker to make the extension while the paint on the core panel was still wet, as small fragments of wood have been found embedded in the left-hand planks. And yet in other cases, such as in Stormy Landscape with Jupiter, Mercury, Philemon, and Baucis, or the Watering Place, it seems to have taken time. He lived with them for some years, had them framed, hung, and possibly moved around in his collection where they were studied and copied, reflected upon and discussed, before he chose to retouch and extensively expand and reinvent the picture plane, thus altering the subjects and arriving at their final stage in his final years. This sensation of movement resembles to some extent the wandering gaze, the wandeling, or vagare, as described by the Roman collector, connoisseur, and patron dealer Giulio Mancini in 1621, of contemporary private collectors and connoisseurs while looking at their landscapes, which ultimately resulted in a renewed vigor, a product of their contemplative leisure. Rubens's landscape provided a space of active otium for the intellectual and physical exercise that elite society at the time regarded as pleasurable and fundamental to the preservation of health, virtue, and nobility. So, in closing, I would like to suggest that for Rubens, painting his landscapes quite literally seems to have become a place of extended contemplative leisure, or otium. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for this, Karina. And it is now my very special pleasure for me to introduce our second speaker, Professor Elizabeth Mcgrath. She worked at the Warburg Institute from 1970 until retirement in 2010 and has been engaged with Rubens for much of her scholarly life. She has contributed extensively to the Corpus Rubenianum, including Rubens' Subjects from History, which won the Mitchell Prize in the History of Art, and editing and contributing to the volumes on Rubens' mythological paintings. She is a fellow of the British Academy. I would also like to add a heartfelt personal note of thanks. Personal note of thanks to Liz for her unfailing advice and support to me on many aspects of my book and the exhibition. The title of her paper is Earthly Fruitfulness and Gods of Nature in Rubens's Imagery. Over to you, Liz. Liz, can you unmute yourself and turn on your camera, please?
Is it done now?
Yes. And you turn on your camera. We can hear you. That, yeah.
Start my video. No. What do you mean turn on the camera?
I think we're fine. Yeah.
It's gone very big.
No?
The picture. What's happened? Oops. I don't know. It's gone.
Yeah.
Sorry about this, people. But it's.
No worries, Liz. Just I think you have zoomed in a little bit. So if you could please zoom out so that we can see your presentation in full screen.
That's it. Okay.
That's it. Thank you very much. That's great.
Okay. Sorry about that. Shaky start. One major theme of Rubens' art, expressed in so many ways throughout his life, is joy in nature's bounty and fruitfulness. It's of course an element in many of his landscapes, especially the later ones, and in the healthy creatures, human and animal, that occupy them. But it's also an insistent theme of his mythological imagery, with the nymphs, satyrs, silenas, and other rustica numina, or dei agrestes, gods of the countryside, whom the ancient Greeks and Romans liked to imagine haunt woods, mountains, groves, and streams. These gods are deities of a sort, but decidedly earthbound ones, creatures of the open air, spirits of woodland, springs, and rivers, of growth, fertility, and fecundity. Renaissance art presents us with plenty of nymphs and satyrs, with the satyrs almost always in pursuit of or spying on the nymphs. Rubens, of course, enjoyed painting these, but he did more. He showed how these countryside gods were beings of, rather than just in, the landscape, restoring to them their ancient meaning as embodiments of natural forces, impulses, and processes, in a way no other artist ever did. In the course of his life, he even acclimatized them to Flemish and not just Mediterranean settings, as is shown so marvelously in the picture you see here. Like the rainbow landscape, this is a painting that Rubens kept for himself. It remained in his possession till his death, and he expanded and reworked the canvas around the middle of the last decade of his life, when he was painting the great landscapes in the exhibition. So some 20 years after he first made it. Underneath the present work is an earlier version of the subject, now lost to view, except for a few ghostly traces, but reproduced in copies from Rubens' workshop, of which this is one. The basic group remains, but is now surrounded, reworked as well, and surrounded by trees, fields, and a fresh breath of country air. We may imagine we've come upon this cheerful company of divinities as the pert nymph on the left engages with the viewer, inviting us in. Sorry, excuse me. The ancient poet Horace was struck by fear once when in the countryside. He assures us this in one of his odes. He caught sight of the god Bacchus teaching his songs to nymphs and satyrs. Now, it can be bad luck for humans to see the gods, but not the gods here in Rubens' painting. Happy is he who has known the country gods, Pan, old Sylvanus, and the sister nymphs, wrote Virgil in the Georgics. We can feel happy indeed to know these unthreatening beings. As you see, the satyrs and silenas are unexpectedly well-behaved and usefully occupied. Even the satyr who's trying to seduce a bored-looking water nymph with an apple is doing so with remarkable restraint. Here we see how Rubens devised a subject that would marvelously present silenas and the satyrs not just as the usual representatives and symbols of lust and excess, but as fulfilling their true ancient role as deities of fruitfulness. They are fruit gathering, specifically apple gathering, to provide material for the nymphs to use to stuff the cornucopia in the front that symbolizes the earth's continuing bounty. Rubens took as a starting point for this idea the story told by Ovid of the invention of the cornucopia from the horn of Achilles, a river god, who, in the form of a bull, fought with and was defeated by Hercules, who then broke off one of his horns. For Rubens, the important part of the story was what followed, the afterlife of the broken horn. When, as Ovid goes on to tell, the naiads, the water nymphs, took it and filled it with fruits to become the cornucopia. Thereafter, in ancient myths, the cornucopia supposedly overflowed eternally. But Rubens preferred to imagine that it did so because it was constantly topped up with fresh produce, not only by naiads, but by satyrs and silenas as well. It should be emphasized that this idea is a brilliant Rubensian invention. But there is a particular classical text that seems likely to have encouraged Rubens to come up with the idea of making satyrs and silenas help the nymphs, join in collecting the filling for the horn. This is a passage in the elegies of Propersius, where we read of silenas and the satyrs and the sileni, which are old satyrs, as well as dryads and naiads, that is wood nymphs and water nymphs, gathering apples. He writes, and the crowd of hamadryad sisters saw this, as did the old sileni and the father of the band, Silenus, that is himself, with whom by Ida's cave, you, O naiad, gathered apples, catching them in your hands as they fell. This passage, as it happens, was anything but obscure, as it had been highlighted in scholarly discussion in Rubens' time. The last line about the naiad had been given a notable emendation by the famous classical scholar Joseph Justus Scaliger. It had also been discussed at length by Rubens' mentor Justus Lipsius, who devoted much attention to Propersius. He was planning to write an edition of his letters, of his poems, but he didn't get around to it. In his Antiquae Lectiones, first published in Antwerp in 1575 and much republished thereafter, Lipsius had used this passage as part of his evidence for a theory he had, an extended discourse on the meaning and associations of apple gathering in antiquity, not just as tokens of love, but as a metaphor for sexual intercourse. Lipsius himself protests he was taken in and shocked to discover this. I suspect Rubens knew and was amused by this discussion, but the apple gathering in his painting seems to embrace a wider message than just sex, although it is there. Silenus and the satyrs, of course, formed part of the retinue of the wine god Bacchus. Around the period when he painted the first version of this work, Rubens was particularly fascinated by Bacchic subjects, as well as by themes of nature and fecundity, and began fusing the two together. This was when the artist created, along with his colleague and friend, Jan Bruegel, the charming tribute to the goddess of nature, in which Bacchic creatures, including festive Ethiopians and silenas, join with the nymphs and satyrs to garland the fertile deity. The statue of the goddess of nature herself, the many-breasted Magna Mater, Great Mother, is being cleaned up and given a new garland. This idea Rubens took from descriptions of yearly rituals of garlanding in Ovid's calendar poem, the Fasti. Since Rubens' collaborator Jan Bruegel was such an expert in fruit, vegetables, and garlands, as well as flowers and animal life, Rubens planned to replace the little woolen string necklaces, which are called lanii vitae, or which are familiar from classical imagery, and you see on the statue here, that Mother Nature has had to do with up to now, with very much more weighty and substantial garland of real fruits of the earth. This garland is being suspended and decorated by nymphs, satyrs, and Ethiopians. That Black Africans form part of the Bacchic crew relates to a whole set of associations in classical writers of Bacchus and the satyrs with India and with Ethiopia, as well as with the fact that at this period, Rubens particularly liked painting Black figures. One of these Bacchic Ethiopians is supporting and presenting to us the drunken Silenus. Silenus arrives carrying a torch as if he was coming to a festival, for this is a celebration of nature's bounty. By enlisting the Bacchic creatures of antiquity in the service of the fruitful goddess of nature, Rubens gave old Silenus, fat, fleshy, and drunken, a new role as a figure of autumnal fullness and ripeness associated with the fertilizing of the earth. The subject comes to fruition in the amazing drunken Silenus in Munich, another picture that Rubens kept with him all his life, expanding and elaborating the composition over an extended period. In this picture, Rubens and his Silenus and his Bacchic companions are accompanied by peasants who, some of them at least, drunk as they are still surprised at the sight of the sozzled mother satyr slumped on the ground with her feeding fat babies that they've stumbled upon. And it looks as if Silenus is about to stumble over. This picture, as I said, Rubens kept and displayed, in fact, we know in his house. It started around 1618 with just a few figures and just over half length, as we saw in Nico van Hout's talk yesterday, and was enlarged probably a few years later to a full-length scene to include the satyresque group and a number of peasants, young and fresh-faced as well as old, along with a child who is the image of the artist's own son. The accommodation of gods and peasants that we see here for the first time in Rubens' art was certainly influenced by Virgil's eclogues, but perhaps also by his younger colleague Jacob Jordaens, who embraced wholeheartedly the connection of Bacchic themes and peasant country life. It culminates in the wonderful peasant dance in the Prado, where, as Christine Belkin and Niels Buettner have emphasized, a couple of people dressed as Bacchic gods, or gods themselves dressed as peasants, are part of the dance. If they are gods, the dancers are perhaps unaware of this. In Rubens' art, we viewers are sometimes allowed to see things that the characters in the painting only sense. Nowhere more so than in the amazing picture in Vienna, known as the Feast of Venus. Here, nature's abundance and fruitfulness echo the imagery of human love and fecundity. Infants and fruits combine to garland the central scene, which is inspired at once by texts and images, principally a painting by Titian and a poem by Ovid. And here again, we have yet another picture expanded and reworked by Rubens over time. As is well known, the painting that provided the inspiration was Titian's Worship of Venus, a recreation of the description by the ancient writer Philostratus of a picture he supposedly saw in Naples. It showed, and Titian shows, Cupids gathering apples. Yes, here we are again with apple gathering. In a feast of playful love before a statue of Venus, to which two young women are bringing offerings. Rubens had made his own copy of Titian's composition not long before he began the Feast of Venus. And here is Rubens' copy now next to the Venus feast. The poem that was Rubens' main textual inspiration was a passage in the Fasti, Ovid's account of festivals in the ancient Roman calendar. This same passage, adapted to nature, had in fact been a crucial source in the earlier homage to nature. In Book 4, talking of Venus's feast days in April, Ovid writes, "Come and duly worship the goddess, you Roman mothers and brides, and you who do not wear chaste garlands and long robes," by that he means prostitutes. "Remove the golden strands of necklace from the marble neck. Take off her rich ornaments. The goddess is to be washed all over. When her neck is dried, put the gold necklaces on again. Now she's to be given other flowers, new roses." Rubens made the central motif of his painting the annual cleaning and redecoration of the statue of Venus by women of different class and status, from respectable matrons to prostitutes, all gathered together. Rubens has shown these rites of Venus taking place outside the city of Rome, where the temple of Venus Erycina was said to be situated. At the same time, the artist ingeniously gave a learned twist to Titian's motif of young women entering with offerings. They no longer bring a mirror and tablet, but they bring dolls. Rubens had read in commentaries on classical authors that he had, as well as in the scholarly handbooks in his library, of how dolls were presented to Venus Erycina by girls who were about to marry. The two young women on the right, dressed in sumptuous versions of contemporary costume, are evidently offering up their childhood dolls who are dressed similarly, as they now hope to have real children of their own. It's clear that this is a picture not just about love, but about the fruits of love. Whatever Venus is being celebrated, she is Venus Genetrix. The association of love with fertility is the unifying theme of the picture. This explains the wonderfully extravagant way Rubens embroidered the scene with imagery of nature's fecundity and Bacchic celebration. A riotous troop of bacchantes and satyrs has broken in and rushes through from the right, enlivening but without actually disrupting the performance of the rites of Venus. The two young women approaching the statue do not apparently see the babies flying or playing with their fruity garland, nor do they see the Bacchic throng, but we are surely to understand that they imagine them and feel themselves caught up in the atmosphere of sensual excitement, even abandon when we look at the satyrs and nymphs on the left. An atmosphere which is, however, not simply erotically charged, but which is imbued with the impulse to procreate, as they offer their dolls in a votive exchange for real children. Rubens has, I already said that viewers in Rubens' paintings often are allowed to see more than the people in the pictures. Here, Rubens is allowed as a sight of the joyful accompany of babies and bacchanals. And we know from recent technical examination that as the picture developed from the central core with the outside bits added, the women in the picture lost more and more of their clothes. Here, Rubens shows not just his familiarity with classical poetry and imagery, but his creative engagement with it, transforming the rites of Venus into a Bacchic festivity. He even allows a satyr to carry off a nymph on the left, who is a distinct resemblance to his wife, in a wilder version of the peasant dance, in which any sense of keeping to the game of the round dance is lost in the fun of it all. As has often been noted, this group almost repeats those uninhibited dances from the famous village or peasant wedding or kermesse in the Louvre, of which we see a detail. Upper-class young women like those on the right in the Feast of Venus can't be seen behaving like peasants, but through the magic of Rubens' imagination, they're drawn in as the unseen Cupids part to make a path for them into this celebration of Venus and love amid the countryside revels of the gods of nature. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Liz. That was wonderful. We are now, excuse me, I get my camera back on. We are now going to have a very short break until 5 to 3. So 5 minutes, and we will see you then.
Oh, God.
So welcome back. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Galinda Gruber, who is currently acting director of the Gemälde Gallery of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, where she has been curator of Flemish Baroque paintings since 2006. In addition to contributing to 2 volumes of the Corpus Rubenianum dedicated to Rubens's mythological paintings, Galinda has recently published Rubens's Great Landscape with a Tempest, Anatomy of a Masterpiece. And her exhibition, Higher Powers of People, Gods and Forces of Nature, opened just last night. So many congratulations, Galinda. The title of her talk today is The Stormy Landscape with Philemon and Baucis, Some Sources of Inspiration. Over to you, Galinda.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I just have to start my PowerPoint. Yeah, I will focus primarily on Peter Bruegel, Delder, and Titian concerning the sources of inspiration of the stormy landscape, with a short excursus on classical antiquity before ending with a brief discussion of my thoughts regarding the chronology of the complex creation process of our stormy landscape. In the inventory compiled after Rubens' death, in 1640, the landscape now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum is listed as a great landscape with a tempest, being the history of Baucis and Philemon, or as you see here in the French version, un grand déluge avec l'histoire de Philemon et Baucis, which is why I did decide not to mention the gods in the talk, in the title of my talk, although they are of course very important. In 1640, the painting is already described as a great landscape with a tempest, showing us that these features were considered the most obvious, which they are. Nevertheless, I want to start with the mythological story. Ovid recounts the tale in his Metamorphoses in the 7th book. Accompanied by Mercury, the father of the gods visited Phrygia, but the only ones to welcome the disguised deities were a poor married couple, Philemon and Baucis. Enraged, Jupiter decided to turn Phrygia into a deadly muddy morass as punishment, but he saved his aged hosts. In Rubens' painting, we see them struggling up a hill to safety. Mercury has laid a protective arm around old Philemon while listening to Jupiter. The latter's eagle has just alighted on the tree behind the group. I hope you can see it a little bit better in this detail. Clutching his thunderbolt in his right hand, Jove is pointing with his left towards the fast rising waters, which have already inundated everything up to the middle ground, uprooting trees and even carrying away a cow. A few desperate figures are trying to save themselves. Rubens used classical sculptures as model for Mercury and Jupiter. His Mercury is actually informed by 2 celebrated ancient works. Scopa's Meleager, which Rubens may have known from a Roman copy in the Pigini collection, formerly Fusconi collection, and which features a very similar pose. The Viennese Mercury is a variant of the Mercury executed by Rubens' workshop in 1636-37 for the Torre de la Parada series, which is now in Madrid, and for which statues of Meleager have already been identified as models. And we know that in the 17th century, this statue was interpreted as an Adonis. It seems that during the 1630s, Rubens repeatedly used this statue of Meleager in his composition. I will come later to the fact that Mercury in Vienna probably dates from after 1635 too. However, the way the deity is holding his caduceus, which seems to rest on his lower arm, has much in common with the Hermes Mercury in the Farnese collection, which you see in the very right of my slide. A Roman copy after Praxiteles that Rubens saw during his Roman sojourn. We know that Rubens copied another version of this statue, the Hermes Belvedere, documented in a drawing by the cantor, but the god in the Belvedere was already without his Sadduceus during Rubens' lifetime. So the Farnese version is the most probable source. Rubens' Jupiter obviously quotes the celebrated statue of Apollo Belvedere, which the artist repeatedly used as a starting point for very different subject matters. Rubens offers us an unusual view of Apollo's elegant pose. We see Jove from the side and from behind. And he might have used a bronze reduction of the celebrated classical work, a practice David Jaffe described in his essay for the Viennese Rubens exhibition in a very convenient way. But let's take a closer look at the landscape. Most of the flooding is concentrated in the left half of the composition, and this is a detail of the inundated houses bottom left, though these floods are not mentioned in Ovid's story of Philemon and Baucis, where Phrygia is instead submerged under a deadly muddy morass. Such a deluge is more reminiscent of the flood in the time of Deucalion, recounted in the first book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, as is known, and as Boscard in his print after the Viennese painting used as an inscription for the print. But Rubens might have had such a deluge in mind when he started the composition. And by started the composition, I mean when he literally started working on the core panel which is clearly visible in this X-ray of our stormy landscape. Here with lines indicated the different stages of the enlargement for those who didn't have the possibility to listen to Ina's or George's talks yesterday. The core panel here on the left once featured a massive rock, as my colleague Ina had discussed yesterday. The white arrows indicate the position of the hill. On the right, the X-ray of the core panel with Ina's digital editing gives you an idea of how the first stage looked like. This rock is similar to the depiction of Ovid's Deucalion flood by Bernard Salomon. This is the version completed in 1559. So there definitely was a massive rock, which today one can just make out in the clouds behind the village. Let me combine it with one of Ina's images to indicate the massive rock. So Rubens might have indeed started with a big flood in mind, and for most of the time, the painting remained a very catastrophic flooded composition. Let's take another look at the X-ray. There is a villa on the lower right, the number 9 here of Ina's image. This villa was first placed bottom right in the foreground as a sort of introduction to the landscape, a repoussoir motif on the core panel that Rubens eventually overpainted. If you compare Peter Bruegel-Deelder's landscape with the flight into Egypt, which is now in the Quartet Gallery, you see a villa in a similar position. I highlight it quickly. And we know that Rubens once owned this painting. It is listed as number 191 in the above-mentioned inventory of his estate, a landscape with the flight into Egypt by old Bruegel. Number 192 lists the hill of St. Gotthard by old Bruegel, but unfortunately this picture is lost. However, Rubens was deeply familiar with landscapes of Peter the Elder, and his inventory of his estate also lists landscapes of other painters like Jan Willems, Jan Bruegel the Elder, Peter Snijers or Adrian Brouwer, as well as by Dutch artists including Cornelis van Polenburg or Herman Saftleven. Rubens was clearly fond of landscape, as so many people of his time. There are many other references to Bruegel. Let me mention just a few. Look, for example, at Bruegel's Alpine landscape with a deep valley, part of a very successful landscape series here in the printed version produced by the Deuticum brothers. The valley has a bridge marked by the black rectangle, which reminded me of Rubens' bridge. And here, both bridges in detail, you see that the idea of this valley is really quite similar. Karel van Mander advised landscape painters to study Bruegel, but he also recommended Titian's woodcuts as excellent source of inspiration. Rubens' core panel, with its slightly elevated horizon and emphasis on spatial depth, is in fact also reminiscent of Titian's landscape ideas, which were known through prints disseminated throughout Europe. Here I brought you as an example this landscape with a dragon. Details like the trees behind Philemon and Baucis also resemble creations by Titian. The motif seems like the paraphrase of a tree from Titian's tree repertoire. The woodcut St. Jerome in the Wilderness includes a trifurcate tree with its dead third stem broken off in a way that is very similar to Rubens' version behind the elder couple. In the Viennese stormy landscape, Rubens transforms different visual sources of inspiration. One might have been this print by Egidio Sadela after Roland Savaray, showing a hare hunting in a forest, but the scene is dominated by a huge fallen tree with wonderful roots and a lot of brambles in the left corner. The composition becomes very dramatic with this monumental fallen tree in the very foreground, which Rubens might have used for this detail of the stormy landscape on the right side. In his stormy landscape, Rubens combined two stories from the Metamorphoses while simultaneously illustrating a rarely depicted moment from the story of Philemon and Baucis, their rescue. Most artists following illustrated edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses showed Jupiter and Mercury in the house of Philemon and Baucis. I present you here how Rubens' master, Otto van Veen, depicted this scene in the Horatian Emblemata in 1607. Thank you very much, Karina Kleinert, who kindly pointed me to this illustration, which I had completely forgotten. And she rightly noted that the eagle seems to be the source of Jove's eagle in the painted stormy landscape. Another detail may have Titianesque roots. The goat in the foreground on the right. While the devastating floods have inundated the left half of the composition, one on the right, the gods have saved the hospital old couple. Note below this group, the goat near an uprooted willow. Here in detail, attempts to connect it with Jupiter remain unconvincing in my opinion, because Amalthea allegedly fed the infant deity goat milk is not, it doesn't explain it here. But Rubens placed the animal not directly below the father of the gods, but below Baucis, which is another indication that it's not really linked to Jove. This goat almost seems to be one with the tree. Many of our visitors have troubles finding it. This quasi-merging with its surroundings reminds me of a famous woodcut attributed to either Titian or Domenico Campagnola, two goats at the foot of a tree, in which the goats are just as much in harmony with their surroundings as our goat. Another possible reference is Titian's landscape with a milkmaid, which shows goats to the left of the cow. Christopher Brown has already demonstrated the importance of this print for the farm at Laken. Here is a detail where the nanny goat on the right seems to have just paused munching on the leaves of the bush, whereas the Viennese goat is very happily jumping to the tree to eat. While discussing this small detail in Rubens' composition in Vienna with Niels Büttner, he mentioned Konrad Gessner's illustration of an Alpine ibex, a wild goat that lives in the mountains of the Alps. We know, of course, that Rubens owned Gessner's books, but is this a reference to the mountain the old couple has had to climb? I'm not sure about this, but it may have had a special meaning as Rubens added it relatively late. We can deduce this from a drawing attributed by Corinna Fricklund to Lucas von Uden. Here the whole version, Ines Lama already talked about it yesterday, showing just the detail, because it is a very interesting intermediate state of Rubens' composition in Vienna. Note, for example, how the willow, which in Lucas von Uden's drawing is still standing, has been changed into a fallen tree ending up as food for the goat in the final version of our painting. In that regard, the X-ray of our painting is a bit confusing as it shows the riders below Philemon and Baucis, which is why I'm showing you Eden drawings to illustrate this change. But when did this happen? In his 19th century catalogue entry to our painting, Max Roses accepted only the foreground and the sky as autograph. In his opinion, the middle ground was too schematic and detailed to be by Rubens, and he suggested that it was executed by Lucas van Uden, with some later retouchings by Rubens. Well, although I think that he was correct in assuming that Rubens retouched the core panel, I do believe that Rubens painted the whole painting of a longer period of time. Rubens has retouched Rubens. There is enough evidence to support the assumption that Rubens started the stormy landscape in the 1620s and continued to work on it well into the 1630s. Yesterday, Ina showed you this slide with the different stages of the stormy landscape from the core panel measuring only 66 per 65 centimeters to the final panel measuring 147 per 209 centimeters. The painting was enlarged twice. And I do believe that he started in the 1620s. Christopher Brown has proposed 1625. Have a look at the watering place of the National Gallery in London, which does show some details close to the core panel in Vienna. Note, for example, how the brambles in the watering place on the left, and generally dated to around 1620, are more clearly defined. I mean, this is a detail from the already enlarged panel. The use of dark brown and black contours increase space and depth. This and the colors are close to what we find on the right of the core panel of the Viennese painting. Another important picture for a chronology of the painting now in Vienna is a landscape by Paul Brill, which is dated 1610 and which is listed in the inventory of Rubens' collection as a landscape with the story of Psyche. By Paul Brill. Here the French inscription, un paysage de Paul Brill avec l'histoire de Psyche. Well, we know that Brill originally depicted Saint Jerome in the wilderness, as the X-ray clearly shows Saint Jerome where the knees of Psyche are today visible. Let's have a look at the detail of this composition. Confronted with a Saint Jerome of Brill from the painting today at the Mauritshuis in The Hague, let me combine this so you see it a little bit easier if you're not used to this X-ray. The painting was altered by Rubens. I mean, if you have a look at the Psyche, this is clearly not a female figure painted by Paul Brill. Rubens switched it into Psyche and Jupiter by reworking both the hermit and parts of the landscape. Have a look at the eagle, and parts like the rainbows or the spray and some detail in the water are, in my opinion, clearly done by Rubens. If you compare it with details of the stormy landscape, it is quite evident in my opinion. And I have to thank Alejandro Vergara for the very fruitful discussion in front of the paintings with him in Vienna and Madrid. The eagle in the Vienna landscape on the right is reminiscent of its cousin in the painting now in Madrid, particularly its shape and pose. However, he looks a little bit different. The less detailed handling of the Viennese eagle suggests it probably dates from the 1630s. I believe a comparison between these beautiful leaves in the landscape with rainbow in the Wallace collection on the left and the leaves in the painting of Vienna on the right confirms that they were executed at more or less at the same time, which also indicates to 1635. And these were only a few examples which I wanted to discuss. Just a few selected aspects of the stormy landscape. Other colleagues such as Ulrich Heinen, Karina Kleinert or Hans-Joachim Raub have previously pointed out how multi-layered and complex a painting it is. Rubens' composition continues to inspire and prove food for thought. Yesterday we opened the exhibition Higher Powers, in which the stormy landscape is juxtaposed with the costume of a storm demon from the Brazilian jungle, known to punish people destroying the forest. This confrontation shows how much in touch with nature the story of Philemon and Baucis is, especially viewed with the eyes of today's, where their reward is being turned into trees. Knowing how Rubens devised and developed this landscape in which for a long time nature with all her terrible powers ruled without a glimmer of hope, makes it even more impressive how Rubens, by transforming the composition into the history of Philemon and Baucis, added a beautiful and harmonious prospect that can touch and move us still today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Galinda. That was fascinating. And I think the discussion is going to be wonderful, bringing all these different manifestations of nature together. I'd now like to, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Niels Buttner. He is Professor of Art History at the State Academy of Art and Design in Stuttgart and specializes in the visual culture of Germany and the Netherlands from the 15th to the 17th centuries. He has published widely on Rubens, including 2 volumes of the Corpus Rubenianum and on landscape painting. The title of his paper is Rubens's Landscapes and the Dutch Republic. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you, Lucy. Since Belgian independence in 1830 and the subsequent search for national identity, the painter Rubens has become an embodiment of Flemish art. At the same time, efforts were made in the Kingdom of the Netherlands to define a Dutch art of its own, independent of the Catholic South. The nationally oriented art history of the 19th century took up this separation of a Dutch and a Flemish art. In the art museums, then set up as a public institution, it became a self-evident criterion of classification. These categories of ordering knowledge, which have rarely been questioned since that, are at odds with the sources. Rubens's life was overshadowed by the armed conflict that had begun long before his birth and was not to end until 88 years after his death. The Dutch Republic fought a war against the Habsburg Empire for over 80 years, but this did not alter the fact that the 7 northern provinces and the south of the Netherlands, which remained under Habsburg rule, were regarded by their inhabitants as by foreign visitors as one cultural unity. The painter Rubens shared this idea of a cultural unity of the Netherlands with the Dutch diplomat Constantijn Huygens, who between 1629 and 1631 decided to record the history of his life. The Latin manuscript contains a commentary on the painters of his time, stating that in the light, flourishing, lively execution of the figures and any condition of men and animals, and likewise of the figures of trees, rivers, mountains, and landscape elements, all kinds, which are now rapidly produced with the highest skill, the Netherlanders, Belgae, if anyone, and I do not exclude antiquity here, are superior. Huygens wrote about the painters in our Netherlands, in Belgio Nostro, referring to the entire territory of today's Netherlands, Belgium, and some parts of northern France, which were traditionally perceived as a common cultural region. And it was certainly not by chance that he had used the reference to his landscape painting to evoke the cultural unity of the Netherlands. This superiority of the Netherlands in the field of landscape painting can also be proven statistically. At no time and in no place were more landscapes painted than in the Netherlands of the 17th century. This flowering took place above all in the Dutch Republic, which also became the world's most important marketplace for painting during the so-called Golden Age. All this is well known. Rubens's relationship to the Dutch Republic has not yet been studied in detail with regard to landscape painting. The following remarks are intended to make a contribution to this. Rubens's first journey to the Dutch Republic is documented for the summer of 1612. Rubens was still in Antwerp on 30th April. Soon afterwards, however, he traveled to Haarlem together with Jan Bruegel, Hendrik van Balen and others, from where he returned from before 20th of June 1612. In 1620, Balthasar Gerbier reports in his Eer en de Klaagdicht about the late Henry Goltzius that Bruegel, Van Balen and some other masters who were in Holland visited Goltzius and held a feast together with the Haarlem artist. The intensive contacts between the Habsburg South and the republics are also clear from the correspondence of humanists, some of which was already published during their lifetime. Rubens cultivated contact with Dutch intellectuals and, as his father-in-law reports, met and was impressed by Hugo Grotius, Daniel Heinsius, and Dominicus Baudius on his first trip to Holland. Baudius, who had visited the painter in Antwerp, had written poems on some of his paintings. There is also evidence of contact with the Dutch poet Anna Rebus Fischer, to whom Rubens dedicated one of his engravings. She not only returned the favor with a poem, but copied one of his paintings. It is surely no coincidence that soon after his first journey in the Republic, the first printed reproductions of Rubens's works were made. One was the engraving by Willem Isaacs van Zwanenburg after Lode and his daughters. The painting now in Schwerin was probably already in Holland before the engraver's death on 31st of May 1612. Another example is a print of Samson and Delilah, probably made after Rubens' oil sketch by Goltzius' apprentice Jacob Mattam. That Rubens saw a significant market for his work in the Dutch Republic is evident from his intensive efforts to obtain a privilege for his prints there. After first trying in vain, in 1619 he was granted a privilege for his prints by the States General of the Netherlands on 11th March 1620, barely a year before the 12 years truce expired. Many of Rubens's paintings are also found their way to the Republic during the peaceful years between 1609 and 1621, including, for example, the painting of Judith and Holofernes, which hung in a private collection in Leiden as early as 1621. But Rubens not only sold paintings to the Republic, he also bought paintings by Dutch artists, there including several landscapes. The so-called Specification, Galinda showed it, the inventory of Rubens's paintings drawn up after his death, lists several landscapes. In total, 40 of the 314 paintings recorded were landscapes, which in roughly 13% of the entire collection. Of the pictures explicitly characterized as landscapes or seascapes, 15 were made by Rubens himself and 25 by other artists. Very few can be identified with certainty, one being the painting by Adrian Brouwer, listed as Een Landschap in the Maandeschijn, which is now in Berlin. The short descriptions, sometimes with abbreviations or phonetically transcribed names of painters, hardly help in identifying individual pictures. But at least we have the painters' names and an impression of which pictures and painters interested Rubens. They are landscapes and seascapes by his Dutch contemporaries, such as Cornelis Pulenburg, by whom Rubens owned two paintings listed under number 29 and 22, 292, a landscape by Pulenburg, another landscape by the same. Other examples of Rubens's interest as a collector include three Dutch seascapes. 307, a little sea upon clothes by Paracelsus, a landscape of flyers up on board, and two ships up on board by Goyes. These were presumably a seascape by Jan Paracelsus, a landscape by Simon de Vlieger, and two works by Jan van Gooyen that were obviously conceived as a pair. Unfortunately, it is also not documented when Rubens acquired them. Assuming they were typically works of their respective authors, they would have been executed in almost monochrome, showing an expanse of sky above a low horizon. Most probably, Rubens bought them when he himself became more intensively involved with the subject of landscape from the 1613 onwards. However, he could also have acquired his paintings by Simon de Vlieger, Jan van Rooyen, even before the end of the truce in 1621. On the one hand, there's a fact of the relative ease and frequency of exchange between North and South in the years of the truce, and on the other hand, the phenomenon already noted by Ludwig Burcher that the horizon in Rubens's own pictures lowers in the 1620s. Rubens may well have been fascinated by the aesthetic experiments in tonality in Haarlem painting, as well as by the sense of spaciousness that characterizes these paintings. Among the more than 1,500 paintings attributed to Rubens, the number of landscape paintings is small. In 1890, Max Rosas listed 41 in his catalog raisonné. In 1936, Herbert Herrmann increased this number to 46, and in 1980, in the corpus volume published by Wolfgang Adler, 48 paintings are included. None of these paintings is dated. A chronological classification is therefore only possible through stylistic comparison with other works. The Dresden Boarhand, painted between 1616 and 1618, and the Prodigal Son, painted in 1618, are evidence that Rubens was interested in rural motifs and landscapes early on. Still, on 26 May 1618, he professed in a letter to Dudley Carleton that according to his custom, he had employed a man competent in his field to finish the landscapes, solely to augment your excellency's enjoyment. That Rubens made use of the help of experienced specialists is not only tested by the artist's words, but it's confirmed by surviving works. There's ample evidence of this collaboration with Franz Snyders, who specialized above all in animals, or with the landscape painter Jan Wildens. Another landscape specialist, Lucas van Uden, is documented earlier on as Rubens' collaborator. Less known is a Peter Verhulst, who had produced a view of the Escorial after Rubens' design. During a visit to Rubens' studio, this landscape attracted the attention of Edward Norgate. Karina quoted him, who reported it to King Charles I of England. In the extensive correspondence on this transaction, Rubens mentions that the composition, which Norgate considered to be a masterpiece of his own hand, did not originate from him at all, but was, quote, painted entirely by a very mediocre painter of this city called Verhulst, unquote. The correspondence not only provides an interesting insight into Rubens' studio practice, but also demonstrates the painter's sensitivity of nature he saw. For example, he writes that the landscape painted under his supervision is an extravagant subject because the high mountains above the Sierra are difficult to climb and are so high and steep that one can see the clouds deep below, quote, while the sky above remained very clear and serene, as shown in this painting. Rubens' keen sense of this aesthetic also came into his own, where he was not satisfied with other painters' pictures. A fine example was shown always by Galinda, and it is a landscape by Paul Brill, to which Rubens added the figure of Psyche and Jupiter's eagle, who gives her cup filled with water from the river Styx. Apparently, he had not liked the Saint Jerome, who once was shown in this landscape, so he overpainted him, also adding a rainbow. As part of his own collection, this painting documented Rubens' skills in revising the works of others, which were well known among colleagues. The initiative to cooperate in the production of paintings did not always come from Rubens, and just as he made use of specialists in history paintings, the painters who specialized in landscapes drew on the skills of their famous colleague by having figures added to their landscapes by Rubens. Jan Bruegel was one known to be a master of cooperation and worked regularly with Rubens. Several of the jointly produced paintings found their way to Holland at the early date. A nice example is a landscape with Flora and Zephyr, today in Dessau. It once hung in the Stadtholder's Palais of Frederick Henrik, Prince of Orange, and Amalia von Solms in The Hague. Above, a door in the gallery of the Princess. Also in the possession of the Houses of Orange was the painting Diana and her nymphs asleep, spied upon by satyrs, the so-called Munich Rest, which hung in Het Loo until 1713. This list could be continued for a long time, for in the second half of the 17th century, Amsterdam became the most important hub for international art market. A large number of Rubens's paintings were sold here, including many pieces produced in cooperation with other Antwerp painters. Rubens, however, not only collaborated with his fellow Antwerp painters, Bruegel, Wildens, or Snijders, but also with Dutch landscape painters as Herman Saftleven. This is again attested by the inventory of Rubens's estate. A surviving example of the collaboration between Saftleven and Rubens is the landscape with cattle. In regard to Saftleven's biography and a version of the painting signed by him and dated 1631, the cooperation must have taken place in this year, in which Rubens set out on his third and last documented journey to Holland. Rubens had already spent some time in the Republic a few years earlier, and his second journey is also well documented. After the end of the armistice in 1621, the border between the Republic and the Habsburg territory had quickly become a front line again, not easy to cross. It is therefore astonishing that so much communication continued between the northern and southern Netherlands. Because of its fame, Rubens was a traveler of special status, especially as his journeys after the end of the truce were on diplomatic missions. In 1627, for example, he was sent by the Brussels court to The Hague to establish contact with the English court through Charles I's painter Balthazar Garbier, who was staying in Holland. In order to meet Garbier on the territory of the northern provinces, Rubens needed not only a permission of the Brussels court, but also a passport issued to him by the Dutch ruler Frederick Hendrik of Orange. As early as June 1627, the English diplomats had lobbied for Rubens to be issued the necessary document. On 13th July, Dudley Carleton was able to report from The Hague to London how generous the permission issued to Rubens had been. Quote, Rubens, having an absolute and ample passport to come into these united provinces with his servants and baggage, which was obtained under pretense of a treaty betwixt him and Garbier about pictures and other rarities. Quote, end quote. A passport was also necessary for the last journey undertaken to Holland, the issuing of which was discussed in the States General on 27th November 1631. Not only was a passport for the journey to The Hague finally granted, but also the fact that Rubens had a safe conduct, quote, by means of which he is able to visit his own house in Ekeren, end quote. On 29th May 1627, Rubens had bought Hof van Ursula, a country house on the Schoonhoek in Ekeren from Jacques Lumans. According to the contract of sale, it was a beautiful, well-situated country house surrounded by water. Rubens' stays in Ekeren, not far from Antwerp, are attested not only by letters of 14th October 1627 and 10th of August 1628, but also by the account of Constantijn Huygens. As Karina quoted, he reports that Rubens recently, when the plague forced him to swap the city for the flat land, that he then went to Ekeren and painted landscapes. In fact, the death of Isabella Brandt, who had fallen victim to the epidemic in Antwerp on 15th July 1626, may have been the impetus for the purchase of a country estate, which Rubens enlarged in the following years by buying additional land. It is remarkable that Huygens, who had never met Rubens in person at this time, knew about these stays in the country and the landscapes he painted there. This could have been because of the aforementioned safe conduct that Rubens needed to travel to Ekeren. What the landscapes painted at the time looked like is not documented. There's not even a picture of the house, which is described as a magnificent building surrounded on all sides by water with a round tower. It is tempting, however, to see the Hof van Ursula depicted on the so-called part of a castle in Vienna, shown here, but then the idyll presented in the painting would be deceptive. After the siege of Herzogenbosch in 1629, Ekeren increasingly became a battlefield. Since then, hardly a day went by without Dutch soldiers coming to Ekeren. The Spanish appeared only rarely, but then in large numbers. They usually stayed in Ekeren for several days or even weeks and caused a lot of damage. That Rubens witnessed these events is illustrated by drawing illustrating a service in the church in Ekeren, which is stuffed with the peasants' belongings. This increasing insecurity may have been one reason for Rubens to look for another country estate, and so he acquired Het Steen in 1635. Hagen's autobiography, which remained unpublished during his lifetime, is not the only testimony of Rubens' early fame as a landscape painter. Albert Norgel, for example, wrote that Rubens was delighted in his later time as he quit all the other practices in picture and story, whereby he got a vast estate to study landscape, whereof he hath lived through all the best that are to be seen. He actually knew originals by Rubens, but in his book he could also rely on the fact that his intended readers might at least have access to engravings after Rubens's landscapes. For in fact, Rubens's early fame was also and above all determined by the graphic reproductions of his paintings. The fact that he was also especially appreciated as a landscape painter is also due to a general increase in interest on the part of the art-loving public in pictures of natural surroundings of man, from the beginnings of the 1630 onwards. There was a steadily increasing demand for landscape paintings on the international market, which Rubens also served. The increasing interest is testified by the number of paintings that have survived to the present days, including the numerous painted copies of the Rubens's landscapes. They appeared on the art market early on which the various repetitions of Saftlesen's landscape with Keppel is a good example. When a whole series of Rubens's own landscape paintings, which had never been sold during his lifetime, came onto the market after his death, they were particularly sought after by the after commodity. Several of them sooner or later found their way to Amsterdam. An example of this is the landscape with the windmill and woodcutters painted in Rubens's last years, which is now in Paris. The engraving made after the picture points to Michel Leblanc, the first owner in Thus, to Amsterdam, where he lived. The Richelieu collection also contained no fewer than 6 landscapes by Rubens, but not one portrait, although these would have been certainly more readily available. Presumably, Richelieu and his advisor de Piel saw portraits, as Rubens himself did, as rather a marginal aspect of art. On the other hand, the more educated public appreciated depictions of landscapes with reference to their accommodation in ancient sources as wall decorations. This was one factor in the success of Rubens's landscapes, in particular on the Dutch art market. The fact that even though they continued to be highly esteemed as works by his hand, they were never influential there, was probably due mainly to the fact that the monumental style of international courtly art established by Rubens and the artificiality of his compositions lost importance as a result of a general change in taste. But Rubens' paintings remained an integral part of the visual culture of the Netherlands and Europe, and especially in Great Britain. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niels, and thank you to our 4 speakers for their absolutely superb papers. And so can I invite you all to put your cameras and mics on for the Q&A? Our 4 speakers, yeah, great. So, wonderful. I'm going to start with a question for Karina, if I may. To what extent did the understanding of Rubens's landscapes as otium continue down the centuries? You referred to the idea in the correspondence of de Piel, for example. Was the idea perpetuated in art writing of the 18th and 19th centuries?
Well, the thing with otium is that it really depends on the period or the person. and what they thought about it. Otium has a wide range of meanings. We know that, for example, with Rubens, it was quite influenced by Neo-Stoicism, and to achieve a measured means, a golden mean between vices and virtue, you have these different meanings of, for example, noise and tranquility, countryside and the city. We know that, well, the taste for otium in landscapes changed. During the middle of the 17th century, they were more interested in pastorals. So I think it really depends on where they went, whether they went to France, in which collections they went, what the interest was of the collector. And it's a thing of interpretation, really, I think.
Great, thank you. I've had Liz, which is regarding direct antique sources for the paintings that you discussed today. I realize this is a big topic. Presumably a fusion of many different sources or brought to life in Rubens's typical
yes, I
exuberant
mean,
way.
well, which one? Well, let's take the
So
nymph.
we had a question just referring to the fact that Jordaan's allegory of fertility and the Wallace Collection is based on a directly based on a classical prototype in the form of the Bacchic antique sarcophagus at the British Museum.
Okay. Oh, you mean the little figure? The guy's got the little figure on his shoulder.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah, and then, yes. Well, I mean, where it's a difficult question, because by the time most of the pictures I'm showing, by the time Rubens has sort of absorbed the classical, and of course figures are related to, for example, the Crouching Venus. I mean, his nymphs have already been sort of formulated with reference to antiquity, but he's gone beyond this. Yes, of course, he used formula from sarcophagi, he used formula, and then probably taught things to Jordaans too. And of course, they worked together a lot, Rubens and Jordaans, in the late 1610s, and learned things from one another, usually. Anyway, that's enough.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I love this idea that you presented of the idea that the viewer is more initiated into the scene in a sense than the figures, or at least the figures can see, but perhaps, or can't see, but can feel or sense the presence of these.
This idea, I mean, it was the art historian Philip Fail discussed this in terms of Venetian paintings. You know, you all know probably the famous Concert Champêtre, so-called, in the Louvre. But he, I think, solved the iconographic problem, which, in the sense that the two women in this picture are nymphs who are unseen by the men in the picture, who appear to be ignoring them. You know, you have two clothed men and two naked women in this famous picture. So, I mean, I think that was already in Venetian pictures, this idea that there are things in the landscape which not necessarily everyone sees. And it applies, I mean, of course it applies to religious pictures very often, because a donor doesn't see the people in the picture. I don't know if anyone's written a book about this, have they? It seems a good subject, you know, people who don't see one another within pictures. And whether it applies to other kinds of pictures, I'm not sure yet. Yeah.
Well, it's also lovely in the rainbow landscape, the way that the figures can't see the rainbow, because it's, you know, they're walking, it's behind them, but there's still a sense that they're
either facing out or not seeing it. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I have a question here for Galinda. Could it be possible that the metamorphosis of the stormy landscape to a deluge myth has anything to do with the Burkhardi flood of 1634? So a historical event, a flood in those years, shortly before he returned to the painting.
Burkhardi flood was?
The flood was when?
In 1634.
Was it in?
Well, I do think that he
Netherlands.
started his our painting earlier. So maybe the fact that he changed it then into something very positive in adding or in switching it to Philemon and Baucis, the story of Ovid, has to do something with this. But the original idea, the original flood must have been separate, independent from that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it was on the North Sea. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Great. And Niels, I was also very interested in this. Well, of course, it's important to remember that in Rubens's day, the landscape did not look as beautiful, or at least as tranquil as he depicts it in his paintings. As you described the situation with Acheron, where he had to obtain a passport, is that right? And that the landscape was very much marred by civil unrest at the time. Would you like to comment?
Oh, he's on. No.
Can you, if you'd like to comment, would you like to unmute yourself?
Oh,
I have another question too for Karina. Apart from the humanistic aspects of otium that you rightly highlighted, is it not also telling that this is also on a more basic level coherent with Rubens's noble status when living at Het Steen?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we know that Rubens really was raised and educated to have a career at court. He knew everything. He knew everything in the classics, yes, definitely. I mean, I think he also, and Niels, of course, thinks that he strove really to achieve a title, and at the beginning of the 1630s, he was knighted by the King of England and Spain, and it might be have also been his that he really wanted to buy a feudal estate with a fief, so he could really hold the title. So yes, absolutely, definitely.
Great, wonderful. Yes, and so we've seen nature in its all these wonderful manifestations. I love this, an idea obviously which resonates very much with us today, the idea of restorative nature, contemplating nature, and the sort of restorative and healing powers of nature, which of course is something that the humanists of Rubens and his circle were very interested in.
To go back to the point about Acheron, I mean, I was quite struck in a way I didn't really realize before at how this, I mean, we think of Acheron as a place on the outskirts of Antwerp, how close the war was and how it was dangerous, you know, to go there. And it's quite, gives you quite a different impression of life at the time, and why he needed Het Steen in another direction.
Yes, absolutely. Both indeed on a sort of practical level, and also, yeah, I mean, it just affecting life in so many different ways. I think I have time for one more question. So, or if maybe if any of the panelists would like to comment or ask each other a question. Okay, right. Well, in that case, we will now have a short break, and we will be back in 10 minutes, back at 4 o'clock. Okay, thank you so much to our speakers again for a really, really fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Just before I hand over to Dr. Alejandro Vergara, the chair of our final session, I'd like to share an insight into two parallel investigations into the provenance of Het Steen and the rainbow landscape. Since my book was published, my colleague Natalia Munoz Rojas and I have continued research on the Madrid and Genoese aspects of the provenance. On the Madrid and Genoese aspect of the provenance, and discovered that Professor Katlijne van der Stichelen and Laura Dora at Leuven University had made some interesting discoveries, which present us with a conundrum, as we shall see. Perhaps we can even work out the answer this afternoon. I'm delighted to invite Dr. Alejandro Vergara, Senior Curator of Flemish and Northern European Paintings at the Prado, to moderate this session. Over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks also to the Wallace Collection. Right now at the Prado, we have Titian's Perseus and Andromeda from your collection hanging, and it's good to be part of this international network. Our profession is very much part of a network, I feel, so I'm very glad that I can be part of this today. We're going to start our afternoon session with Dr. Bert Batteu, who's curator of research collections at the Rubenianum in Antwerp. He studied at the Catholic University of Leuven and received his PhD there as well on the cultural history of portraiture in early modern Flanders. I met him in 2012 when I was working on an exhibition on the young Van Dyck at the Prado, and uninvited or unsolicited, he showed up and told me that he thought he could help us achieve to help us borrow Van Dyck's Christ Carrying the Cross from St. Paul's Church in Antwerp, which was something that we very much wanted to have, but had not been successful in achieving at that point. So I learned about his generosity at the time. It reminds me a bit, I should add, of the spirit of working friendship that I think pervades the Rubens field at this point in time, at least. I'm as intrigued as all of you are by his explanation in the program, where he says that he will explore the history of Het Steen, Rubens's country house or castle, which he purchased in 1635, just south of Mechelen. And he continues his description of what he will say by saying that he will take the contested laundry basket as a point of departure. Bert, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Alejandro, and thank you, Lucy and Felix, for making this happen. As the rather mysterious title of my talk indicates, I was initially going to discuss the contents of a laundry basket filled with documents on the history of Het Steen found in the castle's attic. While very interesting as such, the laundry basket also prompted me to reassess the broader archival record on Het Steen. So instead of rummaging through the basket, I will take you on a virtual journey. We will approach Het Steen through cartography, most of it manuscript, some of it unpublished, and through several new archival sources, which I can only mention in passing today. On 5 May 1835, the very first train on the European continent passed through the landscape Rubens bought a share of nearly exactly 2 centuries earlier. The illustration is a later celebration of the half-centenary of the event. From Brussels to Mechelen via Vilvoorde, passing through the villages of Eppichem and Weerde, the trajectory of the historic voyage through this precise area is not a coincidence. It is indicative of the central role of the Seine Valley in Belgium's economy. It's important to realize that this heartland has for centuries been a stressed environment, intensely cultivated, managed, engineered. This was no virgin territory or pristine wilderness when Rubens arrived. The land was compromised, changed, negotiated with. There weren't just poetics to this place, there was prose as well, and quite a bit of pragmatism too. For centuries, the Seine Valley has formed the central connective tissue of the southern Netherlands. From its source in Hainaut, the river flows through Brussels, joining the Dijlen north of Mechelen, so connecting it to the Scheldt via the Roepel. At just 103 kilometers or 64 miles long, it is but a minor tributary in the large North Sea delta. It is not the sort of river that inspires poets or national pride. In fact, in the early 90s, the river spontaneously combusted over hundreds of meters. This small and sinewy river in a relatively narrow bed formed a crucial medieval trading route between the major urban centers of the southern Netherlands. While the area was rural, the city, trade, and industry were very much present in the background, in the landscape, on the horizon. So our approach today will be a bit unusual. The intent is to resist Rubens's lyricism, at least initially, to not give in to the timeless quality of his landscapes, but to consult less lofty sources on the very same landscapes, to explore different views to that of the painter, like those of engineers, bailiffs, feudal clerks, and surveyors. These differing views can, as I hope to show, considerably enhance and nuance our understanding of Rubens's pictures, and they, on occasion, possess their own poetic qualities. Let's initiate our virtual peregrinations on this unusually large map of the River Seine, over 8 meters long, produced at the very end of the 16th century by court engineer Mathieu Bollin. Bollin set out to chart the river's course with the purpose of devising effective means of flood management. Ironically, his map has itself suffered water damage, particularly in the area that is of interest to us, on the left. Rather frustratingly, on a map full of holes, Het Steen would be right under the descriptive text under number 3, but we are getting close. Note the tower over the river, top left. Just a kilometer north of Het Steen, a sluice tower and a water mill stood over the Seine. The mill profited from the hydrographic circumstances created by the sluice tower, which served to levy taxes on passing ships. Its remnants, the tower stood until the Germans bombed it in 1914, are one of a very few elements of the built environment that Rubens would no doubt still recognize today. I've honed in on this detail as we will return to this location later on. While the sluice or mill do not feature in any of Rubens's landscapes, perhaps because of an association with industry rather than rural calm, I will show that it is from here, perhaps even after taking in the view from the top of the sluice tower, that Rubens conceived the Wallace's rainbow landscape. The sluice tower, known as a spui, was built to retain water behind it, thus providing the mill with a power reservoir. But its main goal, perhaps surprisingly, was to keep incoming water out. So a superficial cartographic survey teaches us quite a bit about the early modern nature of this landscape, which was defined by a tidal river. Incidentally, after centuries of attempts to suppress the tides, in 2017, a high-tech tidal sluice was installed to simulate the effect of the tides, recreating the original ecosystem of mudflats and marshes. Rubens's moonlit landscape from the Courtauld gains new depth when we realize that the moon didn't merely light the landscape around Het Steen, it effectively shaped it, a force of nature cyclically breathing water into and out of the land. It is worth noting that cartography and painting were not strictly separated in the 17th century. Pictorial maps, including all sorts of anecdotal details, were immensely popular. On this circa 1620 map of the area around Mechelen, Het Steen is located somewhere near the rear end of the uppermost cow. The image might give us the impression of an untouched rural area, but in reality, most of the landscape was engineered on a massive scale. This is the ceremonial spade with which the 1550 first sod was turned on the canal linking the capital to the Scheldt, the so-called Brussels navigation. At nearly 30 kilometers long, 30 meters wide and 2 meters deep, equipped with a succession of advanced locks, it was a formidable feat of engineering. On the drawing board since Burgundian times, its realization was crucial to the Habsburg policy of centralization. The canal functioned as a mass transit system and provided a strong stimulus to the internal market. Travel from the capital to the Scheldt would no longer take days over the fickle Seine, but mere hours in comfortable barges over the new waterway, dug just to the west of the river. Tellingly, the earliest cartographic image of the village of Eleweid is from a map celebrating the completion of the canal in 1561. The new waterway would change the landscape in many ways. Villages relying on shipping on the Seine for income suddenly found themselves outcompeted, except when the canal was closed for dredging. Rubens, a keen investor, had a financial interest in the canal, which he sold right before acquiring Het Steen. Het Steen would be midway between the villages of Eppichem and Elewaet. X marks the spot. The closest barge stop to Het Steen was at some 5 kilometers. The success of the Brussels navigation sprouted several new proposals. This 1664 plan by the engineer Antoine van Marke suggested multiple extensions. If Van Marke's vision were to have been realized, a canal leading to the Brussels navigation would have cut right past Het Steen, a second one separating the estate from the village of Elewaet, the dotted lines here. Court engineer and cartographer Michiel Langrenus proposed a more ambitious direct connection to Mechelen in 1663, on the right here. Prohibitive costs and considerable disruptions to existing infrastructure prevented most of these plans to be executed. But it is important to take note of how close to Het Steen several projected canals would have been dug. Some, such as Langrenus' proposal, were partially meant to improve water management in the capital, which, particularly to the north, was prone to seasonal inundations. So this seemingly rural pocket of countryside was in fact deeply enmeshed into large-scale engineering projects and subject to metropolitan environmental and economic policies. It's equally important to realize that events on a macro scale were mirrored in a myriad of smaller interventions. Sedimented meanders of the Seine would be cut through, like on this image. Brooks would be diverted to power mills, dredgings were mandated so as to guarantee the flow of water, etc., etc. Rubens, for his part, diverted the Barebeek to keep the water in the castle moat of Het Steen fresh, and he installed small sluices and canals to control the water table on the estate, and to irrigate, fertilize, and drain pastures. A few of Rubens's landscapes, such as this sheet from the Hermitage, seem to document such small installations. As such interventions could affect properties up and downstream, they were closely monitored by neighbors and local authorities. Rubens's actions at Het Steen were by no means exceptional. Landowners throughout the valley did the exact same things. The cumulated effect of these individual efforts was crucial to the economy. Poor water management would decrease land available for grazing, and it would severely affect the hay harvest and the price of this all-important winter feed, which would in turn raise the prices of staple foods like milk, butter, and meat. It's clear that these knock-on effects made water management a major concern for both the central government and for private landowners. For now, let's close in on Het Steen and its estate. Traveling on horseback or by carriage from Antwerp, Rubens would take this road. The initial stretch from Mechelen was paved, making for a comfortable journey. After passing through the town of Zemst, south of which the state of the road deteriorated, Rubens would arrive at Eppichem, 2 kilometers from Het Steen. This roadmap takes us tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly, no 17th century detailed maps of the area were known. The laundry basket prompted me to track down archival sources from neighboring estates, among which the castle of Perk. Its archives are now kept by the family de la Fayadeuze at Lozer Castle. As I discovered, they contain 2 large pictorial maps of Perk and Elewaet by the Leuven surveyor Johannes Petrebus, made in 1686 and 1687 at the request of Fredericus Ignatius de Marcelaar, Baron of Perk. Rubens and Helena Fulmore died in 1640 and 1673. Yet the estate was still intact and in the hands of Helena's son Hyacinthe de Broeghoven de Bergijk when the maps were made. It was unchanged since Rubens had assembled it. Ledgers made up at de Marcelaar's request provide a key to the maps and document the land owned by Hyacinthe. In short, the maps allow us to locate Rubens's land holdings within their perimeter with great precision. While a large chunk of Rubens's estate can thus be reconstructed, it is important to keep in mind that he also held land in Eppichem and Weerde and further afield, which is not on these maps. The maps are mounted on canvas, and whilst the naive style of the surveyor is evident, they are highly decorative nonetheless. We can imagine how impressive they would look in a monuments room. Together, the maps offer a contiguous description of the landscape east of Het Steen. Every single plot of land is numbered, with each number corresponding to a detailed entry in the ledgers. Colored edges on the maps distinguish arable land from pasture. The precision of Petrebus's measurements is remarkable. There is no difference between his map and maps made up shortly after Belgium's independence in 1830. The territory of Eloët, for example, is clearly distinguishable by its resemblance to a dog's head. Het Steen is situated at the very tip of the dog's snout. This is the earliest detailed cartographic depiction of Het Steen. The next one is on the mid-18th century Villaret map with a much smaller scale. See the inset below left, also showing two wings protruding from the west facade of the main building. The tower is easily recognizable on Petrebus's map. The main house, on the other hand, differs from what we know through Rubens's and Teniers' portrayals. It is good to keep in mind that not a single 17th century image of the sides or the back of the castle is known. There is no indication that Helena Fulmore, her second husband, or their son Hyacinthe undertook building works in the castle. Rubens, on the other hand, definitely had work done, the precise nature and scale of which remains unclear. The wings that are visible here are visible too on the later Villaret map, and while naively executed, the other buildings on Petrebus's map are all depicted realistically. A good case in point is this portrayal of Hof ter Borcht, some 2.5 kilometers east of Het Steen, belonging to the Wallem family. On the left, an etching by Jacobus Harrewijn showing the house seen from the east. On the right, Petrebus's depiction seen from the north. The comparison gives a clear indication of the accuracy of our draftsman. Harrewijn's more accomplished etching served as an illustration to Jacques Leroy's 1699 Castella et Praetoria Nobilium Brabantiae, a luxurious publication featuring the country seats of Brabant's noble families. Oddly, Het Steen was never included in one of these increasingly popular volumes of real estate pornography, perhaps because it did not serve as the longtime seat of a single family, perhaps because it wasn't grand enough, or because it had become architecturally unfashionable by the end of the century. What is striking is that this relatively small stretch of landscape, approximately 5 by 10 kilometers, contains 5 substantial estates and several smaller ones. For 2 of them, Berk, top left, and Scheplaken, top center, extensive family archives have been preserved, and these in turn reveal new information on the history of Het Steen. These properties were simple manorial estates, not aristocratic seats. Generally, the families owning them had no mercantile associations, but mostly long traditions of public service. Several of them were on the cusp of obtaining a baronetcy. Titles such as Lord of Steen were not aristocratic, but feudal in nature. They meant a property was held in fief. Nonetheless, the possession of a manorial estate was often a stepping stone towards a hereditary title. Rubens's neighbor at Berk, Frederik de Marselaar, would be mayor of Brussels during the entire second quarter of the 17th century. His neighbor at Scheplaken, Jan Baptista de Visser, was a high-ranking inspector of the troops who traveled extensively while his wife Cornelia de Norman ran the estate. Several of Rubens's neighbors took on the coveted role of superintendent of the Brussels navigation. What these family archives reveal, again, is that this was no peaceful Virgilian Arcadia. Good fences made good neighbors. A group of horses grazing on land without permission from its owner would lead to litigation, as would damage to even a single tree. Every element of the landscape was an economic resource, and every single bit of land seen on Rubens's paintings was owned by someone. Rubens's predecessor at Het Steen, Jan Kools, was forced to sell because he had loaded the estate with debt, his neighbors being important creditors. Jan Baptista de Visser forced Kools to lease large tracts of his land to relieve his debts. He also grazed his cattle on Kools's pasture and sold Kools's hay after having it seized by a bailiff. When Rubens bought Het Steen, the crops growing on the fields weren't even his. They belonged to Kools's creditors. Financially speaking, the culture was cutthroat. Conflicts often involved property boundaries, and the mending of fences was part and parcel of country life, also at Het Steen. Due to time constraints, I will not delve into these sources. Suffice it to say that I was able to retrieve the 12 May 1635 deed of sale, in which Rubens acquired the property, and the ensuing 12 November 1635 document, in which he fulfilled his feudal duties, officially making him the new Lord of Het Steen. Both documents contain detailed descriptions of the estate. Later land acquisitions, for example in 1638, substantially enlarged Rubens's holdings. There is a sense that he acquired more of the landscape as he painted it. The maps give us a much firmer grasp of the lay of the land around Het Steen. This small landscape with an avenue of trees from Boston, for example, can now be looked at in a new light. The painting, in all its sketchy directness, offers a view from the top of the tower of Het Steen, looking over the avenue leading towards Eluate. The building in the background is Steenhof or Steenwinkel. I'm convinced that the tower, described as beautiful and high in the deed of sale, and the views it offered were the main draw for Rubens. Agriculturally speaking, the estate wasn't prime land, with about 1/4 of it submerged for part of the year. Rather shockingly, a 6-lane motorway with 2 train tracks in its center reservation snakes through this landscape today. So before the pandemic, my commute whizzed me through the Boston picture twice a day. The landscape at the Barber Institute, although almost devoid of topographical features, in all probability shows a view from the Rozenbroek, marshy pasterland just south of Het Steen, owned by Rubens, looking east towards Eluate along the Barebeek, the brook Rubens partially diverted to feed the moat of the house. The spire of the church is just visible in the distance. Slightly further afield, at a 20-minute walk to the south from Het Steen, stood the mill of Perk, again sadly burned down by the Germans in 1914, with only its piers remaining today. From the road from Eluate, the village church of Perk would be visible at this angle. A view from the opposite direction, looking north across the castle of Perk by Jacob van Werde, shows the same area from the southeast. The village church and the mill are clearly visible again. Several of the features on Petrebus's maps can be related to Van Werden's detailed drawing. Teniers's later abode Drie Torens is visible, as is Het Steen itself, just to the left of the mill here and indicated in shorthand. The spires on the horizon are those of the churches of Eppichem on the left and Weerde just to the right of the mill. While the maps present a rather more prosaic and unsophisticated image of the landscape that inspired Rubens, they do hold a certain poetry of their own. Toponyms like Flatstone, Babelbrook, the Long Stretch, Ravenswood, or Fishpool are very evocative. One of these toponyms, the Silver Mead, where Rubens owned land, can even be related to his 4 September 1636 letter to Perez, in which he mentions 2 Roman Antonine coins found near the estate. In fact, unbeknown to Rubens, a substantial Gallo-Roman settlement was buried under the fields of Eluate, only to be discovered in 1725. Much earlier, the name Silver Mead was given to this area because of the abundance of silver coins found there. Before returning to our point of departure and concluding, I would briefly like to reference Svetlana Alper's 1983 book, The Art of Describing, in which she sees a rift between a descriptive art and a scholarly tendency to interpret that art in an emblematic manner, seeking narrative where, according to Alpers, none is to be found. During my research, I was often reminded of her argument. The 1682 sales notice for Het Steen on the left, another document that was presumed lost, with a completely unknown complement to its right, is just that, a description. Petrebus's maps and several smaller maps of smaller plots near Het Steen kept elsewhere are just that, products of what Alpers dubs the mapping impulse. The 1635 deed of sale and the feudal sanctioning of Rubens's ownership both contain long and detailed descriptions of the estate, listing every plot, its nature, its size, and its neighbors. How do such essentially descriptive documents relate to the art of landscape painting, if at all? In some ways, Rubens is a surveyor. The landscape at Het Steen, for example, charts his possessions in the valley. The ambitious panoramic view seemingly designed to include his furthest landholdings in Kapellen, some 12 kilometers to the northwest of Het Steen, and Meusen, 8 kilometers to the northeast. Yet we can hardly call the landscape descriptive. It has been, as Norgate states, un poco aiutato. Rubens has, for example, clustered together several small villages into a town for pictorial effect. He would clearly make for a bad feudal clerk or surveyor, too imaginative. Let us conclude by returning to the sluice tower at Weerde. Rubens owned land here, backing on the Seine River, which slithers its way through the landscape in sharp meanders. With the knowledge of the territory we have gained, it becomes clear that the horizon on the left side of the picture is in fact a topographically correct rendition of the landscape. The church on the left is that of the village of Weerde. The spire to the right of the tree, just left of the rainbow, is that of the church of Eluate, the parish to which Het Steen belonged. Further to the right and the south, we can make out the sunlit blades of the mill of Perk. By consequence, the building beneath the mill is none other than Het Steen itself. While topographically accurate, Rubens has exaggerated minor differences in elevation to add drama. Simply by placing Het Steen right under the arc of the rainbow, with the proverbial pot of gold standing somewhere near the beginning of the avenue leading up to the castle, Rubens transcends mere topography, imbuing description with narrative and poetry. Irrelevant to later viewers, unaware of the geography underlying the rainbow landscape, these topographical details would have been important to Rubens and his family. In fact, once we are able to orientate ourselves, it is striking that the view towards the southwest, towards Vilvoorde and Brussels, has been blocked by a stand of large trees. The clouds gathered above this area of the painting again contain a narrative element that is lost upon viewers who are unaware of the precise location of this vista. Rubens's weariness of the capital, the court, and its schemes and machinations is well documented. It is here, away from the court, shielded by nature, that he found fresh inspiration. One final and conspicuous element of the picture I would like to conclude on is the cereal crop to the left of the composition, in all probability wheat, the most prized and lucrative crop at the time. The shape of the field is odd, a rather small elongated rectangle like a slab of gold. Its position right next to the river is unlikely. Such flood-prone plots would be given over to grazing or hayland, not to rot-sensitive wheat. In my opinion, the wheat is an homage to Rubens's blonde wife, Helena, whose last name, Fulmore, was also the contemporary French word for wheat. Note the milk pail balancing on the peasant's girl's head. From the 1620s, Helena's family used sheaves of wheat as a heraldic device on portraits, gravestones, including hers, and on the tapestry seen here. From archival documents, it is clear that she took on an active role in running the estate, for example, by selling mature trees by the hundreds for timber or by watching over water management. When Rubens's acquisition of Het Steen was completed in November 1635, she had carried him a daughter, Clara Johanna, then 3.5 years old, and a son, Frans, then 2 years old. A third child, Isabella Helena, was just a couple of months old. In the early summer of 1636, she was pregnant again, giving birth to Peter Paul Jr., probably conceived at Het Steen in early spring of 1637. The field of wheat and the milk pail to me suggest a celebration of his wife's fertility. The picture thus isn't just a topographical record or an abstract ode to the fecundity of the Brabant landscape, it is also a deeply personal biographical statement about marital bliss under his very own rainbow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bert. That's an exciting close-up view of the actual place where Rubens put his boots, the land that Rubens walked. Next up is a talk on the early provenance of the rainbow landscape. It's a joint contribution to our seminar by Katelijne van der Stiegelen, who is well known to all of us. She is one of the most productive scholars in the field of Flemish 16th and 17th century art and painting. She has recently finished a volume for the Corpus Rubenianum on unidentified portraits. She has worked on Anthony van Dyck, published extensively on him, on Rubens. She curated an exhibition and published a monumental catalog on Michaelina Vautier. She has worked together as a supervisor on this paper with Laura Dore, who she acted as an advisor for her master's degree in art history at the Catholic University of Leuven. I asked Katelijne about their collaboration and she explained it to me. Katelijne discovered the inventory of Helena Fulmore a couple of years ago in the State Archives in Brussels and asked Laura for her assistance in turning that into broader research, and that's why they have worked together on this. I believe this is a short paper. Before you start, let me remind our participants that you can place questions in the question and answer button or link at the bottom of your screen, but not on the chat button. We're not using that, but please do post any questions that you have in the Q&A button or link at the bottom of your screens. Laura?
Thank you, Alejandro, for your kind introduction. I'm honored to speak at this conference. Around 1652, Helena Fulmore, who had been the second wife of Rubens, moved to Brussels with her second husband, Jan Baptist van Broekhoven, Count of Bergijk, a diplomat and councillor of the Supreme Council of Flanders. 2 years after her death in 1673, an inventory was drawn up of the household effects of her spacious home. Over 200 paintings were listed room by room. One of them is said to be located in the antechamber of Helena Fulmore. Seems to fit a landscape in the Wallace Collection perfectly. However, there are difficulties in understanding the exact meaning of the description in the inventory, and it is of importance to examine these difficulties in order to be able to analyze whether the painting described in the Brussels inventory could be the rainbow landscape in the Wallace Collection. I will start with a brief analysis of the description in the inventory. The document is dated 4 December 1675, and at the start we read that it was drawn up at a request of Jan Baptist van Broekhoven and Madame his companion. By the time the inventory was compiled, 2 years had passed since the death of Helena Fulmore, and van Broekhoven had already married Marie-Françoise de Netière. Hence, one must be careful to distinguish their respective properties. However, it can be assumed the paintings left by Rubens were inherited by Helena Fulmore or acquired by her from his estate. In the inventory, the iconography, format and frame of 238 paintings are described briefly. In most cases, the paintings are attributed to specific masters. 18 of them are said to be by or after Rubens. Among them, one is listed as being located in the antechamber of Helena Fulmore, thus next to her private room, where she most likely received her close contacts. The description runs as follows in French. Item une peinture de cheminée de Rubens, paysage avec un arc et estophation avec des vesses et hommes menant du foin. Thus the first part of the sentence catalogues the painting as a chimney piece, representing a landscape with a rainbow. Furthermore, the landscape included some staffage or estophation, representing vesses, which is the equivalent of vaches or cows. The staffage also included men bringing in hay or hommes menant du foin. Thus, we may translate the description as follows. A chimney piece by Rubens, a landscape with a rainbow and staffage with cows and people bringing in hay. Accordingly, at first sight, the rainbow landscape in the Wallace Collection seems to match the description in the Brussels inventory perfectly. Based on its dimensions, the work certainly corresponds to a horizontal chimney piece. The iconography corresponds to the description since the painting depicts a landscape with a rainbow, a herd of cows, and a number of people occupied in bringing in hay. My interest in this talk is the earliest provenance of the landscape in the Wallace Collection. To reconstruct its history, 3 people are of interest here, namely Rubens himself, his eldest son Albert Rubens, and Helena Fulmore. It's known that the rainbow landscape in the Wallace Collection is found in the auction catalogue or specification drawn up after the death of Rubens. The catalogue includes a description of 314 paintings, sculptures, and some other precious objects that were in Rubens' collection when he died. The rainbow landscape is number 136 and was described in the French version of the catalogue as un grand paysage avec une pluie, which means a large landscape with rain. The English translation intended for Charles I ran as follows: a great landscape where it rains with little cows in it. Not all items listed in the specification were sold. This is shown by the correspondence between Helena Fulmore and an Antwerp art dealer. For example, the impressive family portrait of Deborah Kipp and 4 of her children remained in the hands of Helena Fulmore after Rubens' death. In 1646, she wrote to the merchant Matthijs Musson about a visit by a lady who came to inquire the price of 2 paintings on his commission, asking if he knew the approximate value of the portrait of the English lady with her children. for which she was asking the sum of 600 guildens. This shows that Helena Fulmore was willing to sell the portrait if she got a good price for it, and confirms that she had not sold all of the paintings in Rubens' estate 6 years after his death. Therefore, it's quite possible that the landscape with the rainbow stayed a few years with Helena after the sale of 6040. The aforementioned portrait of Deborah Kipp with her 4 children even remained in her possession until her death. In the inventory of 6075, it is listed as number 81. Item dessus l'autre porte une peinture de Rubens un peu plus grande que la précédente, représentant le portrait d'une dame avec 4 de ses enfants. This can be translated as also beneath the other door is a painting by Rubens, a little bigger than the one mentioned before, representing the portraits of a lady with her 4 children. After Rubens' death, the rainbow landscape is said to have gone to his son Albert. This is supported by an entry in the settlement of Staatsmasse of 1646, which describes the state of the house in which Rubens died and the interest of his heirs. The entry reads as follows. I will read it in Dutch. De voorschreven jonker Albert heeft nog gehad ene grote landschappen de wedergave van dat het steen is, hem aangeschat voor de som van 1250 gulden. This can be translated as the aforementioned Albert has also a great landscape, dependent from that to stenen is, purchased by him for the sum of 1250 guildens. Several recent publications support the interpretation of wedergave as a pendant or equal, and if this is correct, the description confirms not only that Albert was in possession of a large landscape painting, but also the existence of a pendant. Traditionally, the autumn landscape with view of Het Steen, currently in the National Gallery in London, has been regarded as a pendant to the rainbow landscape. There are several arguments in favor of the hypothesis that the 2 landscapes were pendants. Firstly, the dimensions of both works are more or less the same, and both can be dated around 1636. Secondly, the landscape with its stain was mentioned in the catalogue or specification as number 135, thus just before the rainbow landscape, which strengthens their connection. It's described in the English version for Charles I as a great landscape after the life, with little figures in it upon a board. In the third place, a comparison of these paintings seems to show that the composition corresponds, and as we know, also the later provenance of the 2 paintings strongly suggests that they were seen as pendants. However, some questions arise from the entry in the Staatsmasse. The expression van dat tot stenen is seems to indicate that the pendant was then in Het Steen in Elewijd and was therefore in the possession of Helena Fulmore. Next to this, 5 years earlier, in 1641, paintings in Het Steen were valued at 321 guildens. This is a very low amount and does not correspond to the referred value of the large landscape with the rainbow at about 1250 guildens. The question is then whether the pendant was possibly located elsewhere in 1641, for example, in the house of Rubens in the city of Antwerp, and whether it was transported to Het Steen after this date. After Albert's death in 1657, the work mentioned in the Staatsmasse is probably referred to again in his mortuary inventory under the following description: a large landscape, a chimney piece. I turn now to Helena Fulmore. Hereafter, both pendants were probably together in the possession of Helena Fulmore. As mentioned before, the autumn landscape with a view of Het Steen was most likely already at Het Steen. The landscape with the rainbow could have followed at this moment. This idea seems to be in accordance with the new insights that Natalia will discuss in the following presentation regarding the further provenance that proves that the 2 landscapes were already in Spain by 1668. However, these reflections do raise some interesting questions regarding the interpretation of the description in the Brussels inventory of 1675, where at first sight, the landscape with the rainbow seemed to be noticed in Brussels. Is it possible that the Brussels inventory refers to another version of the landscape with the rainbow, Following this idea, another landscape, now part of the collection of the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, also matches the description. Although the Munich landscape is generally regarded as a copy, there is no consensus about the attribution yet, because apparently some little differences can be noticed. In addition, it could also be possible that there was another version that's now lost or can no longer be localized. The information offered by the inventory of a part of the belongings of Jan van Broekhoven-Bergijk and his wife Helena Fulmore is by no means easy to interpret. The discovery of the presence of a paysage avec un arc et estofation avec des vases et emmenant du foin in the prestigious house of Jan van Bergijk and Helena Fulmore in 1675 in Brussels has caused some discussion regarding the earlier provenance of the rainbow landscape now in the Wallace Collection. However, it seems likely that the rainbow landscape from the Wallace Collection was by then already reunited with its pendant, the landscape with Het Steen, in a Spanish private collection. If this was indeed the case, it becomes evident that the landscape avec un arc mentioned in the Brussels inventory may not be identical with the painting in the Wallace Collection. Although it's nearly impossible to identify the chimney piece in Helena's reception room beyond the shadow of doubt, the Brussels inventory has made clear that a rainbow landscape by Rubens was still part of the private entourage of Helena Fulmore 35 years after Rubens has died. Whether it was the version that's currently in Munich, is lost or can no longer be localized, the chimney piece avec un arc must have remembered the elderly Helena at the time that both landscapes were still at Het Steen and probably made her long for the time she spent in Elewaet together with her former husband, Peter Paul Rubens. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laura. Perhaps when Natalia finishes and when we get to our Q&A session, the two of you or the three of you with Katelijne can speak to each other about this disputed possible early provenance. Our next speaker is Natalia Muñoz Rojas, who will speak on the possible Spanish early provenance for the two large monumental Rubens landscapes. Natalia is Enriqueta Harris Frankfurt Curatorial Assistant of Paintings at the Wallace Collection. That means that her position is funded by a foundation in Madrid called the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica, and they promote the study of anything related in any way to any territory that had anything to do with Spain at some point. So I encourage all of you working on Flemish paintings to look to them for support for what you're doing. Natalia belongs to a family that I know well. Her parents and grandparents are frequent assistants to lectures and courses that we give at the Prado, and that's why it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce her into this symposium. Natalia?
Thank you, Alejandro, for a very kind introduction. And thank you, Felix and Lucy, for organizing this event. And a particular thank you to you, Lucy, for inviting me to continue the research on the two paintings after your book was sent to print. Het Steen and the Rainbow Landscapes had been identified as number 135 and 136 in the specifications here quoted. Yet they were not sold in the public auctions that followed Rubens's death, but instead seems to have kept at the family. This part of the provenance is very ambiguous, but as Laura has already discussed it, I will not go into it in any further detail. By 1691, both paintings were in Madrid. Here quoted are the two entries in the inventory of the collection of Juan Gaspar Enriquez de Cabrera, Duke of Medina de Rio Seco and 10th Admiral of Castile, which were identified by Alejandro Vergara in 1995 as being the two great landscapes. 15 years later, in 1706, the two landscapes resurface in Genoa. They are recorded in a deed of sale listing the paintings sold by the sons of Bartolomeo Saluzzo, a Genoese banker and member of the new Genoese nobility, to Constantino Balbi. Het Steen and the Rainbow Landscape remained in the Balbi collection for a century until 1802, when they were purchased by James Irving and brought to London. Their subsequent fortunes in England will be explored by Susanna Avery-Quach and Lucy Davis in the next paper. Having established the points in the history of the paintings, the question remained as to how the two landscapes traveled first from the Low Countries to Madrid and then from Madrid to Genoa. In his 2002 article, Virreyes y Financieros, Mercado Artístico entre Madrid y Génova, Piero Boccardo proposed that the two landscapes were purchased by Luis Benavidez Carrillo de Toledo, 5th Marquis of Caracena, who brought them to Madrid and from whom the 10th Admiral would have acquired them. Boccardo then argued that the Rainbow Landscape and Het Steen might have arrived in Genoa through the Genoese banker Francesco de Mari. We decided to carry further research and to establish whether this provenance was true. Given the restrictions caused by the pandemic, we were unable to travel to the Genoese archives, so we would like to thank Claudio Marsilio and Roberto Santamaria and a number of their colleagues at the Genoese archives for their assistance in our research. The first part of our research consisted in finding evidence for Caracena having owned the two landscapes. In his article from 1996 on the Marquess of Caracena, Antonio Vanugli identified the two Rubens landscapes listed in the Marquess Estate Inventory of 1668 as Het Steen and the Rainbow Landscape. The inventory does not shed any light on the display or dimensions of the works, which prevents us from identifying them with certainty. Yet Caracena's lifelong service to the Spanish crown would have put him in a strong position to acquire them. The Marquess of Caracena served in the Low Countries intermittently between 1630 and 1664, acting as governor from 1659. He acquired a large collection of paintings, partly thanks to the role of David Teniers the Younger as his agent. Teniers was clearly on friendly terms with Rubens and Helena Fulmore. He was a witness at their wedding in 1635 and was the godfather of their eldest son. Moreover, Teniers acquired from Helena Fulmore's second husband, Van Broeckhoven, a country house in the vicinity of Het Steen in 1663. Teniers' patron, Caracena, also met Helena and Van Broeckhoven. As noted in a contemporary newspaper, on Sunday, 21st December 1659, the Marquess and his wife, Catalina Ponce de Leon, visited them for dinner at Het Steen. And we would like to thank Catalina and Bert for this reference. If the painting of Het Steen wasn't still displayed at there, Caracena may have had the possibility of admiring and acquiring it. But what about its pendant? We assumed until now that Caracena may have acquired the Rainbow Landscape during the tenure as governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Shortly after his visit to Het Steen, on the 17th of April, 1660, a great landscape was sold in Antwerp for 100 guilders by the children of Albert Rubens. If that was the Rainbow Landscape, Caracena might well have been the buyer at the sale. However, at this point, Catalina's and Laura's discoveries relating to the provenance of the painting should be kept in mind and could be discussed in further detail in the Q&A. The question remained as to how did the paintings pass from the collection of Caracena to the 10th Admiral. There is some evidence that could support our idea that the paintings passed directly from Caracena's collection to the 10th Admiral. 6 years after the first inventory of Caracena's collection, a second inventory of what remained of his collection was drafted, in preparation for his widow's second marriage. A comparison of both documents shows that the majority of the most expensive works from the 1668 inventory were no longer in the collection by 1674. To our knowledge, there is no record of the sales of Caracena's paintings between 1668 and 1674. However, in the letter here quoted, Manuel de Lira, Spanish ambassador to The Hague, referred to a painting by Gerard Duth that the Admiral had acquired at the auction of the Lord Marquess Caracena. If the Admiral were buying paintings from the collection, could he have purchased the two Rubens landscapes too? The second strand of our research focused on how the two paintings might have arrived in Genoa. Following the death of the 10th Admiral, his collection was inherited by the 11th Admiral, Juan Tomás Enríquez de Cabrera, who you see here portrayed. He was forced to go into exile in Lisbon during the Spanish War of Succession, taking the collection with him. The collection was widely discussed amongst collectors in Portugal and abroad, yet no mention was made of the Rubens landscapes. Instead, as Bocardo argues, it is more likely that the paintings were acquired by one of the many Genoese bankers who were in Madrid at the time and were involved in settling the Admiral's debt. Bocardo proposed Francesco de' Mari as the most likely candidate for this role for the following reasons. De' Mari had acquired paintings from important collections in Madrid. The text you see here is a description of the collections of Francesco's eldest son, Ippolito. Amongst the paintings mentioned is Guy de Rennes' The Toilet of Venus, which was previously been in the Marquis de Carpio's collection, sold after his death in 1687. In addition, de' Mari was in Madrid between 1692 and 1694. This suggests that he was involved in transporting works back to Genoa during the time when the 10th Admiral died and when the two landscapes were first recorded in Genoa. As Roberto Santamaria has shown in some research he undertook for us, Bartolomeo Saluzzo was related through marriage to the De' Mari and the Giustiniani families, amongst others, all connected through their activities as bankers to the Spanish crown. Paintings could have easily been transferred between the De' Mari and the Saluzzos without leaving a paper trace. However, Roberto de Santamaria's research has also shown that Saluzzo had strong ties with the Spanish crown. Through the Saluzzo family bank, which had branches in Naples, Genoa, and Madrid, Saluzzo could have been involved in settling the Admiral's debts and could have acquired the painting this way. After Saluzzo's death, his sons sold the collection of paintings to the future Duke of Genoa, Constantino Balbi. Constantino had recently inherited the palazzo from his grandfather and embarked on a mission to enlarge the paintings collection. When he acquired Saluzzo's paintings in 1706, he also reframed them, and he could have possibly reframed and enlarged the paintings when they traveled from Saluzzo Palace to the Balbi Palace. The paintings remained in the Balbi collection in the Secondo Salotto, as recorded in the 1724 inventory of the Balbi collection, until the end of the century in 1802. And this is the palazzo of the Balbi Palazzo, which was whose staircase was painted by Fragonard in 1761. In 1802, they were purchased by James Irving and brought to London. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Natalia. We're going to hear about the slightly later provenance of the two paintings from Dr. Susanna Avery Quash, who's Senior Research Curator for the History of Collecting at the National Gallery there in London. And also from one of our hostess, Lucy Davis, Curator of Flemish and British Paintings at the Wallace Collection, and our good colleague. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for the introduction. Het Steen and the Rainbow Landscape, together with a Roman Triumph, arrived in London in 1803 from the Balbi Collection, Genoa. They were part of a larger group of pictures which reached England in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. Many were bought from Genoese collections by the art agent James Irvine, acting for William Buchanan, and his partner Arthur Champernowne. They also imported Peace and War in 1802, The Horrors of War and St. Ignatius Loyola the following year, and St. Bavo in 1805. Other dealers followed suit, Andrew Wilson, for instance, importing The Brazen Serpent in 1805. Buchanan's correspondence analyses the rage in England for Rubens' work. The dealer perceptively noted that the two great landscapes, by exactly hitting the taste of the market, proved an excellent speculation. Elsewhere, he conjectured, I dare say a fine Rubens would by 9/10 of the nation be preferred to a Michelangelo or Raphael. The bustle, vigour and spirit of his pictures is suited to the genius of the people, and his fascinating colouring overpowers everything. Buchanan initially offered the two great landscapes with peace and war and a Roman triumph to the government. All four were rejected because the government was not willing to spend money on art. Buchanan then turned to the wealthy financier cum collector John Julius Angerstein, who also declined them, saying that he did not have room for them in his London townhouse, number 100 Pall Mall. Angerstein's collection ultimately included two Rubenses, The Rape of the Sabine Women and The Holy Family. Buchanan's next strategy was to exhibit the landscapes for sale as a pair at 4,000 guineas, according to the diarist Joseph Farrington. At Oxenden Street Haymarket, they became the talk of the town. Het Steen passed into private ownership when Lady Margaret Beaumont, shown here in a mezzotint after Sir Joshua Reynolds, purchased it on the 25th of May 1803 for £1,500 as a present for her husband. She effectively separated the pair because she didn't have enough money to buy both. Perhaps she preferred Het Steen, thinking its depiction of Rubens' estate and house would happily evoke Beaumont's own country estate, Cole Orton, in Leicestershire. Rubens' painting was cherished by Beaumont, seen here in a portrait by John Hopner in 1803, the year his wife acquired Het Steen. Beaumont was a leading tastemaker, with responsibilities to several artistic institutions which spread his influence, including the British Institution. As a patron, he bought works by living artists, including David Wilkie. As a friend and admirer of Reynolds, first president of the Royal Academy, Beaumont spoke out against those who felt contravened Reynolds' articles of faith, such as Turner with his radical colouring. John Constable's cenotaph to the memory of Sir Joshua Reynolds, seen on the right, depicts the monument Beaumont erected in the grounds of Cole Orton, which he situated near busts of Michelangelo and Raphael to demonstrate Reynolds' place in Europe's artistic lineage. Beaumont's interest in art of the past was stimulated by his grand tour in 1782. Over the next 20 years, he built up a collection which included Michelangelo's Taddei Tondo and his favourite work, Claude's painted landscape with Hagar and the Angel. Having acquired Het Steen, Beaumont had it conserved by Benjamin West, then president of the Royal Academy, and displayed it prominently at 34 Grosvenor Street, a London property inherited by his wife. In 1808, it was transferred with other prime paintings to Cole Orton. Beaumont encouraged artist friends to come and stay and study his pictures. Benjamin Haydon recalled a happy fortnight. Sir George painted and Lady Beaumont drew, and Wilkie and I made our respective studies for our own purposes. We dined with the Claude and Rembrandt before us, breakfasted with the Rubens landscape, and did nothing morning, noon or night but think of painting, talk of painting, dream of painting, and wake to paint again. Het Steen reached wider audiences in 1815, when shown at an exhibition organised by the British Institution. In 1813, the British Institution had mounted its inaugural exhibition dedicated to deceased masters, with Reynolds as its focus. The following year, its second such display focused on other pillars of the British school, notably Hogarth, Gainsborough and Wilson. The 1815 exhibition was the first given over to long-dead masters, and the chosen topic was Dutch and Flemish 17th century art, mostly the work of Rubens, Van Dyck and Rembrandt. Het Steen was shown with its former companion, alongside other important landscapes, two shown here, The Watering Place and Landscape by Moonlight. The catalogue remarked on Rubens' wide-ranging genius. For richness of colouring, grandeur of design, and facility both of invention and execution, no painter ever surpassed him. Het Steen, but not the Rainbow Landscape, was lent to a later British Institution exhibition in 1823. Het Steen was central to the foundation collection of the National Gallery, being a jewel in the crown of Beaumont's collection, which became the first gift the gallery ever received. It was a trip to Italy in 1821 which convinced Beaumont of the need to educate British public taste, as well as a concern about what would happen to his collection after his death because he had no heir. Consequently, Beaumont began to campaign for a national gallery, promising to bequeath pictures if suitable accommodation were granted. This offer was made more tempting still when, in 1823, Beaumont proposed giving 16 paintings immediately on condition that the British government bought Angustine's collection that was then up for sale. Parliament did purchase 38 pictures from Angustine's executors, as well as the remaining lease on his London townhouse, which opened as the first National Gallery in May 1824. Beaumont's gifts were transferred in 1826. Het Steen can be seen in the far room in this watercolour of the interior of 100 Pall Mall, painted by Frederick Mackenzie in about 1830. Beaumont continued to shape the National Gallery's collection through his appointment on its first board of trustees. Within the National Collection, Rubens was deemed a fundamental cornerstone from the start. Initially, works by Rubens came mainly as gifts or bequests, as recorded here. Peace and War was presented by the Duke of Sutherland in 1828. St Bavo came with the Holwell Car bequest in 1831. The Brazen Serpent was bought in 1837, and a landscape with a shepherd and his flock was bequeathed by Lord Farnborough in 1839. Importantly, Rubens' reputation survived the sea change which occurred with the gallery's reconstitution in 1855. Henceforth, a gallery under the directorship of Charles Eastlake aimed to become a survey collection able to show the entire story of Western European art, rather than carrying on being a treasure trove of already acknowledged masterpieces. The vociferous art critic John Ruskin, keen to ring the changes, fumed, for instance, in 1844 when the National Gallery purchased Rubens' Judgment of Paris. And a pretty way, by the by, Mr. Eastlake takes to teach our British public a love of the right thing, going and buying a disgusting, rubbishy, good-for-nothing, bad-for-everything Rubens and two brutal Guidos. Important mid-century purchases of Rubens' work continued. Minerva and Mercury Conducts the Duke of Buckingham to the Temple of Virtue was accessioned in 1843, while his Roman Triumph and the Horrors of War were both purchased from the Samuel Rogers sale of May 1856, which took place just 8 weeks before the Alford sale. Rubens' place within the Artistic Hall of Fame at the National Gallery was guaranteed for several reasons. Firstly, as a prime representative of 17th century Flemish painting. Secondly, for his contribution to the landscape tradition in general. And thirdly, for his influence in particular on the growth of English landscape painting in its more naturalistic vein, exemplified by Gainsborough and Constable's work. Thus, Gainsborough's The Watering Place was recognised as inspired by Rubens' painting of the same title, while Constable's six-footer landscapes of the 1810s and 20s were discussed as homages to Rubens, particularly the Haywain with its Flemish-looking wagon. So why didn't the National Gallery secure Rubens' rainbow landscape when the opportunity arose? Well, it's clear that the issue wasn't a lack of interest so much as a dire shortage of money. Eastlake, on becoming the gallery's first director in 1855, continued to encourage the purchase of Rubens's, as he had done previously as its keeper and then as trustee. Theoretically, he was in an even stronger position, given that he now had an annual purchase grant of £10,000 at his disposal. Yet in practice, in the face of increasing competition from super-rich collectors like Richard Seymour Conway, the fourth Marquess of Hertford, he stood little chance in the sale room. Although Eastlake converted Monsieur Richard into a friend, as noted by his wife, when the Eastlakes met him in Paris in 1859, so that Lord Hertford refrained from bidding on 2 Rysdales that Eastlake wanted from the Stolberg sale that year, in earlier and later sales, he proved a less amenable rival, as the following examples in relation to the old masters will prove. At the Spanish Gallery of Louis Philippe in May 1853, Eastlake was keen to secure Velázquez's portrait of Philip IV's little son, so he applied to the Chancellor to be able to bid on that work for up to £840, but Gladstone capped him at a mere £630, and in the event, Lord Hertford secured the work for well over £1,000 more, for a total of £1,680. At the Northwick sale in July 1859, Eastlake's estimates for 21 pictures, including Chima's St Catherine you see in the middle, once more proved far too low, with the consequence that the Chima ended up being purchased by fellow bidder Lord Hertford. And at the Portales Gorgia sale in Paris 1865, Eastlake missed out again on Franz Howell's Laughing Cavalier when his rival outbid him once more. Matters in 1856 reached an all-time low for Eastlake, partly due to the ongoing battle he was having with John Morris Moore, an art historian Moncay, who was raging against him over a disputed Raphael. Lord Elcho, on Moore's side, declared in Parliament on the 6th of June 1856, "Now, although Sir Charles Eastlake is President of the Royal Academy and Director of the National Gallery, his opinion has no weight with the artistic world." Eastlake's position certainly wasn't strengthened by the gallery's failure just 3 weeks later, on the 26th of June, to secure the Rainbow Landscape at the author sale, an episode for which he got the blame, as Lucy will now explain.
Lucy, I think, there you go.
What was the fate of the Rainbow Landscape after Lady Beaumont acquired its companion piece in May 1803? At this point it came into the sole possession of the dealer Arthur Champernowne, after he exchanged his loft and his daughters by Guido Reni for Buchanan's share in the Rubens. When Champernowne lent the Rainbow Landscape to the British Institution's 1815 exhibition of Dutch and Flemish masters, to which Beaumont also lent Het Steen, it was the last time that the paintings would be seen together in public until now. Champernowne must have sold the Rainbow Landscape sometime between the end of the exhibition and his sales in 1820 and 1821 to the collector George Watson Taylor. According to the dealer John Smith, the selling price was 1,500 guineas, exactly the sum Lady Beaumont had paid for its companion. Here we see Watson Taylor kneeling before a Titian in the right-hand image, an imaginary gallery picture painted a few years after his major sale of 1823, when he had parted with the Rubens. At that sale, the Rubens was described as the Balby Rubens landscape, a storm in harvest, a very celebrated chef-d'oeuvre, one of a pair, which were formerly ornaments of the Balby Palace at Genoa. It may be safely pronounced one of the most glorious effects by Rubens. This shows that even after their recent separation, the two paintings were still discussed as a pair. It was sold to Horatio Walpole, the 3rd Earl of Orford, for the very large sum of £2,730, setting a record for Rubens sold at auction. Watson Taylor, a notorious spendthrift, must have been delighted to see his painting sell at 1,230 guineas more than he had paid for it about 8 years earlier. For Orford, it was a bold, early acquisition made for Wolterton Hall in Norfolk, the house he had inherited the year before, along with his title. As noted by Carly Collier, it was the most expensive painting Orford would acquire, and was, I quote, a self-consciously dramatic announcement of his arrival in the world of British connoisseurs. It was hung in pride of place in the principal dining room, with official portraits of family and royalty. Displayed in a setting where it would be admired by its owner and his guests during meal times, it mirrored what Beaumont had done with its pair, as Susanna has explained. A year after Orford purchased the Rainbow Landscape, the first print of it was published, an aquatint by Frederick Church Lewis, which cited its location at Wolterton. It is likely that Orford was behind the commission. In the 33 years it remained at Walterton, the rainbow landscape attracted a number of artists, dealers and art historians, among them John Sell Cotman, John Smith and Dr. Gustav Wagen, who remarked in his pioneering survey of British private art collections, Art Treasures of Great Britain, published in 1854, that the picture is equally admirable as the one at the National Gallery, and I can quite imagine why Lord Orford was induced to give the sum of £2,600 for it in 1823. In 1856, the rainbow landscape was put up for sale again, and for the last time. Orford's collection was sold almost in its entirety in a 3-day anonymous sale, which attracted huge interest. On sale were also works attributed to Canaletto, Velázquez, Rembrandt, Domenichino, Murillo and Sassoferrato, as well as some early Italian paintings. Journalists reported that great crowds filled the auction room for what proved to be a field day for the renowned auctioneer James Christie. Such events presented the chance to see works of art not otherwise normally on view. The Rubens, described as the gem of the sale, was reported to be sufficient to stamp any collection with celebrity, and was puffed by the loquacious auctioneer in a rainbow-tinted speech, conveying that George IV had previously offered £6,000 to Lord Orford and told him it was a standing offer. The King's offer is recorded in the auctioneer's book. The bidding began at the price Orford had paid for it, £2,730, and rose amid great excitement. There was a round of applause when the picture was first announced, and another when it was knocked down to Richard Seymour Conway, 4th Marquis of Hertford, represented by his agent Samuel Mawson, for the vast sum of £4,550. This was then a record-breaking price for a Rubens sold at auction, either in London or Paris. To give a sense of comparative value, John Everett Millais' income in that same year, his most successful year, was only £2,750. According to press reports, the National Gallery was the underbidder, with claims that it bid high. However, it is said that the gallery's agent was permitted to bid up to £3,800, £750 below the hammer price. Unless the gallery's agent exceeded his commission, someone else presumably must have been the underbidder if Mawson had to pay £4,550, but it is not clear who it was. It seems likely that the director of the National Gallery, Sir Charles Eastlake, was not himself present at the Orford sale, but rather was represented by an agent. Indeed, it is Bentley, the National Gallery's agent, whose name is recorded in the auctioneer's book for another purchase the gallery made at the same sale. The newspapers expressed disappointment that such a great painting had been lost to the nation, with Punch directly blaming Eastlake. Now he's gone and lost that Rubens. The Illustrated London News lamented that this was not the first time that Lord Hertford had deprived the nation of great paintings. Susanna has mentioned some instances where he outbid Eastlake. The critic in the London Illustrated News cited another major loss, Reynolds's Strawberry Girl at the Samuel Rogers sale 2 months earlier, which remains a prize in the Wallace Collection today. There was speculation as to where Lord Hertford's collection was kept, perhaps in packing boxes at his agent Mawson's in London or in Paris. There was some truth perhaps in such complaints. Lord Hertford was not particularly visible in Britain, residing in Paris, and was reclusive, suffering bouts of serious ill health in this decade, confiding to Mawson that really it was silly for him to be buying pictures at his age. Unlike many of his contemporaries and immediate predecessors, he was not actively involved in the formation of art museums. His criteria for collecting were personal and intuitive. He talked about his paintings as his family, and not particularly systematic. There was a growing sense that great art should be seen by the public and not kept concealed in private collections. Only months before, a committee had been formed to organise an unprecedented exhibition in Manchester called the Art Treasures of Great Britain. In their reports of the loss of the rainbow landscape to the nation in the 1856 sale, the press claimed that the Art Treasures Committee had already requested loans from the 4th Marquis. It could be that adverse criticism of the sale influenced Lord Hertford's decision to lend 44 of his old master pictures including the Rainbow Landscape, to the 1857 Art Treasures exhibition. The Rainbow Landscape was the second most expensive painting Lord Hertford ever bought. Later on, in 1868, during the directorship of Eastlake's successor, Hertford outbid the National Gallery once again when he paid £7,280 for Terborch's The Ratification of the Treaty of Munster, a painting which Sir Richard Wallace later gave to the National Gallery. As my colleague Suzanne Higgert has suggested in her recent book on Sir Richard Wallace, it is possible that he meant to compensate the National Gallery for their having been deprived of the opportunity to acquire two such significant works of art. Despite the high price and the press attention surrounding it, Lord Hertford was never to see the Rubens after he became its owner, because ill health prevented him from returning to London, where the painting remained, being transferred to Manchester House, now Hertford House. However, as Suzanne Higgert has discovered, within a few years of this purchase, there was speculation among the Hertford family that Lord Hertford intended to present his collection to the National Gallery so that the public might remember him in a favourable light. There were other rumours that he intended to establish a museum in Paris. Is it possible then that the idea behind the extraordinary gift that was to come to the nation in 1897 in the form of Lady Wallace's bequest may have originated with Lord Hertford himself, perhaps prompted by a controversy over his purchasing activity brought to a head over the Rainbow Landscape? The Rubens has been displayed in the Great Gallery of the Wallace Collection since the 1870s, just 2 miles away from its pendant at the National Gallery. The two paintings are almost invariably discussed as a pendant pair, but it has seemed impossible that the two could ever be displayed together again. This was because Lady Wallace's will was interpreted to mean that works from the collection could not be shown alongside those from other collections. For this reason, in 1982, the then director of the Wallace Collection, John Ingermals, wrote of the 1856 sale that the chance of bringing the pictures together was thus lost, as it turned out, forever. In 1997, the Rainbow Landscape was not lent to the major Rubens Landscapes exhibition at the National Gallery. However, the year before, it had been sent to the National Gallery's Conservation Department for a few hours for minor conservation work and so that the two paintings could be seen together. From conversations had that day, the experts gathered came to the conclusion that the two paintings had almost certainly been intended to be hung opposite each other. Now, thanks to this unique reciprocal loan agreement between the Wallace Collection and the National Gallery, which first involved our loan of Titian's Perseus and Andromeda to the National Gallery, and now the National Gallery's loan to us of Het Steen, it is possible at last for the public to see these two masterpieces together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. You're the hostess, but I'm glad to be able to thank you as the host of this session. It's exciting and fun also to be reminded of the vividness of the history of collecting. I wonder if Laura and Catalina and Natalia want to have a word with each other about the provenance issue. You may not be ready for that, or you may not want to do that publicly, but let us know. And you may all want to open your screens and mics also, I think.
Maybe, can I ask something? Yeah, to Natalia. Natalia, I'm just wondering, in how far are you convinced that the paintings were already with Caracena in 1668? Because when you're really convinced that that was the case, we can only be sure that the landscape with the rainbow in the possession of Helena Fulmore in 1675 must have been another one, presumably the Munich one, but I don't know. Are you really sure that they were with Caracena in 1668?
I don't want to say I am 100% sure because I showed you the inventory entry and it just says 2 landscapes by Rubens, nothing else. But the circumstances around Caracena put him in a position to buy them, as I argued. And then there's also the fact that it was a very easy transfer from Caracena's collection to the 10th Admiral, so it is extremely likely. I also know that there is someone else carrying out research into the 10th Admiral collection, Cristina Agüero, and she's going to be publishing an article on it soon. So perhaps that may contain some new information that will bring further light onto your research.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I remember reading the corpus volume on any major painting by Rubens. There's so many versions early on. I think Neil's writing on the Garden of Love, I think there's a record of 160 versions, something like that. So, you know, this man's fame was so huge so early on that we can expect a lot of this. I'm afraid we run into it all the time, don't we, about different versions at places that both seem likely. Yeah, I was curious. I'm going to read one question. Natalia, do you have any other comments, Susanna or Natalia or Catalina, about your particular papers? Or
no, I just wonder if there is someone who is really familiar with the landscape in Munich. I have never seen the painting, and I think it is not exhibited at this moment, but maybe knows more about it. I was just wondering if Karina has some ideas.
she may not be with us anymore.
No problem. Just a question about attribution.
Related to all this provenance and history of collecting of Rubens, I'm curious about one thing about his reputation in the UK, especially. It seems, if in the case of Spain, I think in the case of all the Western world, that he has a really sustained fame and prestige and reputation among scholars, connoisseurs, collectors, even though the popular taste for him oscillates. I think that's fair to say. I wonder if that's the case in the UK as well, and I wonder how representative is John Ruskin's judgment of his paintings in that one sentence. He's such a hypersensitive man. One wants him to understand Rubens. He's such a Puritan, on the other hand, that one can understand how he may feel far from Rubens.
Well, I think John Ruskin was desperately hoping that with the reconstitution of the National Gallery in 1855, that there would be some new tastes entering the scene, and that the trajectory that the National Gallery had been running on for the first 30 years of its existence, Alessandro, would change. You know, there was the same old, already acknowledged masters. And as you say, Rubens represented the Flemish school par excellence. There's never any problem. He also, in terms of scholarship, but in terms of collecting, the Grand Manner taste was then all the rage. So there was never any problem of getting gifts or bequests or purchases into the National Gallery. I think John Ruskin, with the sea change, with the idea that the National Gallery should represent all areas of Western European art from its origins to the present day, it should be starting to collect a new type of art. So he was obviously banging his drum on behalf of early Italian art and the earlier schools, and he felt that the National Gallery was already sufficiently full of wonderful Rubenses. So he probably didn't like the taste personally, but I think he felt that with new funding and with a new sense of direction, why was Sir Charles Eastlake, who was known to be Catholic in terms of taste, why was he continuing to collect Rubens? Obviously, the director had to act, you know, pragmatically, what was on the market, what was available, and so on. But I think Ruskin's comment was because he wanted the new director to go in a new direction and collect new types of art in terms of early Italian art.
It's interesting to me that you use the term Catholic taste. Pagan taste would be the term for Rubens in my mind, mainly, at least for the Rubenses that we have here for the most part. Let me read one question. Well, we have two questions. Let me find out what they are and I'll read them. They come from Theodore Williamson, and Bert, this one may be for you. As the landscape around Het Steen is carefully engineered, might the painting be seen as a nostalgic view of a landscape shaped by the hand of man? and its pendant, the rainbow, as a landscape whose fruitfulness is guaranteed by the hand of God, the covenant represented by the rainbow? We can, anybody can answer that, anybody that feels.
I don't think there's necessarily a contrast between the two pictures. I think there's more of an overlap between them. Mills and church spires, like the mills are sort of emblems of industry, and the church spires of religion are spread out through the both of the paintings. But I do find it interesting to think about this idea about a nostalgia, about a landscape that was actively changing, like the canal, for example, which was probably the biggest human mark on the landscape made in the southern Netherlands. There are barely any iconographic sources on it beyond sort of maps or technical type drawings. There are 2 sketches in existence, but it seems that everyone turns away from it. They're looking at the landscape with back towards the canal or industry. And there are 2 drawings, very small drawings by an Italian visiting artist, really small sketches. Remigio Cantagalina is his name. We know there were commissions made to document the sort of construction of the canal, tapestry series, even drawings by Peter Breugel were commissioned, but it seems that none of that has been realized or has survived. So there was definitely a sense of nostalgia, of sort of looking at the best bits of the landscapes and editing out industrial new additions to it. I don't know if that answers your question.
You spoke about, Bert, resisting Rubens's lyricism. Of course, that's why we are all drawn to him. And I think you did a great job. It was exciting. I think for me, it really was to actually walk, in his footsteps. And yet it is all about lyricism in the grand paintings, maybe not so much in the drawings, but Rubens, to me, to all of us, I think it's about poetic imagination, and everything you showed is the springboard for that. And I was reminded by a photo that I think Nils showed us earlier today of the Escorial landscape, of which we don't know an original, and the actual painting that we know is not so great. But you can walk up to the actual place near the Escorial where Rubens was. Still in trail maps today, it's called Punto Rubens. It still has that name, oddly enough. Probably not because of the memory of his trip there, but because of some connoisseur having liked to hike around the area. But once you walk up there, if you look at the painting, you see 2 mountain ranges. To see those in real life, you need to turn your head about 180 degrees. You cannot see them in one at once. So it's interesting that this idea of realism also is just a very different thing then than now. But anyway, I just wanted to point out how when one lets one's imagination fly as a result of Rubens taking us there, it's exciting to come back and step on the actual ground like you helped us do, Bert.
Confinement has been good in this research. I've done a lot of walks around Het Steen, and also archives have remained open in Belgium on appointment. So it was one of the few places where you could get a sense of perhaps.
Well, that's fabulous, yeah.
Bert, I really loved the point you were making about how this land is really low lying and really prone to flooding, as happened, as you gave some examples. And again, going back to the poetic imagining of the landscape that Alejandro was just talking about, could you say a little bit more about how the horizons look quite elevated in Rubens's view, thinking of what Alejandro was saying about how in that other landscape he was talking about, you're seeing more than you could actually see from the ground at Het Steen.
This is definitely one of the reasons why I think that the tower was attractive to Rubens. He must have seen it earlier when he traveled from Antwerp to Brussels countless times, so he must have known the place. And he sort of puts you in a bowl. Like if you stand on the ground, you can't see anything. It's flat. Like the difference in elevation within the commune of Eleweet is 3 meters. So this is marginal. So he seems to like curl up the edge of the landscape slightly, exaggerate the features as they are, to give it some more drama and punch, really, because it's a very boring, flat terrain in reality. It looks better in Rubens's paintings.
I was remembering about the sale from Rubens's collection. I was taking some notes. Philip IV bought 32 paintings in that sale directly. There's a bill for those purchases, but then he bought several other paintings. We don't know exactly when, such as the Three Graces. So it's kind of a the selling of that collection is kind of a big thing. I mean, it's hard to trace every item to a particular document. And it must have flooded the market. That's an exaggerated term, but it must have, collectors all over Europe want these works, and you can imagine family members wanting to keep some, and we know that Helena Fulmore didn't sell some. And how much does that confuse the early provenance of these two great landscapes? I mean, what do we know about the first step in that sale? Did I miss something there? Do we know how they go from the collection to the first purchaser?
Well, it's very difficult to see the inventory of 1675 of Helena Fulmore at Brussels in its correct context. As you mentioned, she must have kept many paintings by Rubens in her estate, and through an inventory like this, we get to know one piece by another, but it's a search how to find the right information and to context it correctly. I think that the archives are a rich source of information which can prove another really valued information here too. So.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I can add something. It's really complicated, but I presume that the landscape stain remained with Helena after 1640, and that maybe she acquired the landscape with the rainbow from Albert a couple of years later, probably around 57 when he had died just before. So I think she had the two landscapes with her at Eloïde until the moment that Caracena, when I'm right, Natalia, came to see them and tried to acquire them. It's also important to stress on the fact that Caracena and the second husband of Helena Fulmore, Jan Baptist van Broekhoven, they knew each other very well. And also Caracena, there were two, Laura, am I right, two portraits of Caracena in the house of Van Broekhoven in Brussels. So it's also a mention of the fact that they were very close, and maybe it was not possible for Van Broekhoven to refuse an offer from Caracena. I don't know.
It would have advanced his career clearly.
Yeah.
If she let go of these paintings that meant a lot to her personally, it wouldn't benefit her, but it would definitely benefit her husband.
Yeah.
How many paintings in her collection do we actually know about today? How many Rubens paintings? I mean, are they all identified? Do we know which ones they are in Helena's collection, in the 1675 inventory?
Well, there are 18 paintings that are listed, said to be by or after Rubens. Among them, 6 paintings are listed as by Rubens. And as seen in the presentation, one of them is Deborah Kipp with 4 of her children, probably, because it's always very difficult to link the description with the painting. And another one is a version of the rainbow. There's also a Christ upon a cross, a garden of love, and a mythological painting of the 4 seasons. And the last one was a spring. So it's really various paintings that can be traced in her collection.
But most of the paintings can be identified, unless I think, for example, this peinture des quatre temps de Rubens, for example, it must be something like representation of the 4 seasons. And as far as I know, there's no painting by Rubens known at this moment that can be identified as such. But the important thing is, of course, that they make a clear distinction in the inventory between everything that has been copied after Rubens, described as une copie d'après Rubens, or just paintings said to be by Rubens. And the interesting thing is that the landscape with the rainbow has been registered as a painting by Rubens. So there is no evidence that other paintings said to be by Rubens aren't by Rubens, if you understand what I mean. So we're still waiting for an upcoming landscape with a rainbow that might be an authentic painting by Rubens.
That probably exists somewhere because Rubens' paintings were so valued from early on. There's been a tendency to take good care of them.
Yeah.
Well, Lucy, if you, I don't know, Bert, did you want to say something?
I had one point to add. I thought there was a sort of draft version of the 1675 inventory, like a 1673, but it's very sloppy handwriting. I don't know if it's complete, but it definitely doesn't mention the landscape with the rainbow. So when I looked at these documents, I thought, well, maybe in 73, when she just died, it might still be at Steen. Mm-hmm. Was perhaps brought to Brussels later on. I don't know. Still a lot of research to be done.
Yeah. It's maybe interesting to say that also a Pelskin of Rubens has been registered in one of the let's say archival documents related to the inventory, but it's neither mentioned in the inventory itself. So it's very complicated, and the mass of archival evidence is it has yet to be investigated in depth, I suppose. You know that.
How is that Pelskin described in that inventory? How is it described?
Yeah, it comes up on more than one occasion, but in the end, it's initially it has been described as un portrait de ma mère à demi nue. Laura, please correct.
Yeah, it's correct. It can be traced in many documents, many too actually. One of them is at the estate of the Van Broekhovens, and there the heirs regard to the painting as a portrait of ma mère à demi nue, so the mother half naked. And then it can also be located around 1700 in Madrid, at the residence of Van Broekhoven, because he was consul at Madrid and he had a residence there.
Okay. It's never mentioned as a Venus. I was wondering about that, as my mother as Venus or something like that. She's a Venus Boudica, really. I'm curious about it. Well, Lucy, I think we may be ready to wrap up. Is that right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I'd just like to say, I think as this discussion of the provenance illustrates so well, paintings that we think we know so well and so much about, it's wonderful, really, and refreshing to discover that actually we're still learning and we're still researching them and discovering new pieces of the puzzle all the time. So, and also that very much relates also to Bert's presentation this afternoon, where we've now learned so much more about these two paintings, that they do indeed seem to be actual views of the estate rather than and we can pinpoint consider them actually more as topographical views with recognizable landmarks, and even a glimpse of Het Steen in the rainbow landscape, which is absolutely intriguing. So one of the many wonderful discoveries that we've looked at today. And of course, going back to yesterday, we looked at the extraordinary work, that went into these landscapes, both from the as a collaboration between the panel maker and the artist, the incredible thought processes that went into going back to these compositions and realizing these transformative revisions in some cases, or these changes that were made to the compositions. And then today we've really looked again at the conditions that made this such an incredibly productive time in Rubens's life, with looking at the inspiration he took from Het Steen and the leisure time he enjoyed there, and his chance to contemplate nature and to think about all these wonderful manifestations of nature and fruitfulness. And of course, then zooming out, to use Nico's analogy yesterday, or metaphor yesterday, zooming out to look at his influence beyond the southern Netherlands to the north, and then of course his legacy beyond, and the trajectory of the paintings to Spain and then Britain. So thank you so much. And I'd now just like to, and also just to say that we couldn't have hoped for a better way to mark the opening of our exhibition on the 3rd of June. And we look forward very much to welcoming you very soon. So, and also just to say, please join us for our wonderful series of online evening lectures devoted to Rubens. So our Rubens, thinking about Rubens will continue over the coming months, which begins on Wednesday, the 9th of June. So can I just hand over now to Xavier for some.
Hi, thank you, Lucy. And a very heartfelt thank you to all of you, the panelists, the moderators for joining over these last 2 days. It's been extraordinary to really learn so much about these two great landscapes. There are just here the Wallace walking into the curatorial room. It looks like the BBC has come. We have the sort of central headquarters, and part of those teams are Andrew Nelson, Oliver Jones in the learning department, and Natalia Munoz Rojas and Felix Thorzo have been fantastic in curatorial to keep this together. And Lucy, again, big thank you for masterminding all of this. It's a great feat to try and keep everything to time, and also getting the technicalities all lined up as such. Again, a big thank you to the Monument Trust for sponsoring this conference. And I suppose the next thing really to do is come back and do a bit of slow looking. The two paintings, I've just been down there, and we're just setting up the didactic panels and all that. And it's just the possibility of standing right bang in the middle of those two pictures and just looking from one side to the other. And it's like watching Federer against Djokovic, but don't worry, it's a wonderful experience to be able to literally walk through Het Steen with Rubens in your arm. So do come and see it. It's one of these unique opportunities that will very unlikely be repeated in our own lifetime. So if you haven't been, then you haven't lived. But thank you so much for joining us, and stay in touch. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Alejandro.
And Lucy, all of you.
Un abrazo a Madrid.
Igualmente.
And go and see the Titian show.
You should. You have to come. We have a month and a half left. There's 6 Rubens paintings in this Titian. It's not a Titian show. It's Mythological Passion. So you all can come and see. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucy. Also.
Thank you.